The forest had always been a place of peace for her. The little beauty, tugging at the cloak of the hooded man, peered into his eyes. Without letting go of his hands, the girl asked how soon they would see each other again. After all, when he left, he broke her heart. Being the baby's only friend, the man played with her with pleasure. After all, the uncle was a kind person. But now, stroking the girl's head, he said that for now he had to leave her. However, he promised to return soon. The little girl wanted to know how long her uncle would be gone. While waiting for an answer, the girl did not let go of the man's cloak. However, he did not know what to answer the little beauty, because he understood that it was possible that they would see each other for the last time. He sat down and gently stroked her cheeks, begging her not to be upset. The man asked her to believe and wait for him. But the upset blonde only cried bitterly, and the uncle understood that he had to say goodbye, because his heart was breaking into pieces. Pressing his knees tightly to his chest, he promised that he would return as soon as she very much desired it. And the girl thought only about the fact that this was the man with whom, for the first time after birth, she experienced the bitterness of separation. She tried to remember him with her childish, short memory. After all, the time spent with him was filled with happiness. She couldn't be upset with her uncle. In her upset feelings, she only asked him not to leave, but he was in a hurry, and her small and trembling heart felt that they would not meet again. Turning around and looking at the girl, he already knew how difficult life would be for her. However, the next moment, having come to her senses and opening her tear-stained eyes, the frightened blonde realized that it was just a dream. The dim light from the broken window fell in spots on the concrete, and the girl lying on the floor with disheveled hair and clothes torn from beatings was clearly freezing. She was conscious but unable to move, and the man who approached her was already reminding the beauty that she was strong and could handle everything. "Perhaps the girl should have been punished further?" asked the young man, who sat down on a chair and looked at her carefully. Trying to get up from the icy floor, the girl said that she didn't care. After all, she had long since stopped resisting the circumstances. He liked to tease her, especially when he saw the resemblance of the blonde to her mother, who was just as proud. But looking into the eyes of her half-brother, the girl, tortured by beatings, already said that he was certainly behaving as befits an emperor. He was irritated by such remarks from his sister. At such moments, Raph believed that the girl had not been punished severely enough for her sharp tongue. Clenching his fists, he again reminded her that she was only an illegitimate child, and therefore could not at all consider herself part of the imperial blood. Realizing that she was a fake princess made him angry. Raph couldn't accept that someone who wasn't born for the throne was suddenly so close to him. And the very next moment, drops of blood from the sister's tender back were already flying across the concrete walls of the basement. A muffled whistle, cutting through the silence, brought pain and suffering to the innocent beauty. After all, touching the skin, it tore off scraps of her flesh. Raph demanded that the girl scream, but all he saw was her body shaking and her muscles tensing. Her power was destroying him. It seemed that the beauty had resigned herself. After all, there were no tears in her eyes, only glass emptiness. But even this was not enough for Raph. Swinging again and again, he waited for emotions from his sister. After all, he needed a scream and a plea for salvation. But the girl only steadfastly endured the beatings that spread throughout her body, from her spine to her fingertips. However, she noted that her older brother began to bully her even more when he ascended the throne. Clinging to her memories, she was already carried away to the time when her father, the previous emperor of the Calyx Empire, brought her and her mother to the imperial palace. The resulting family was rather strange. After all, besides them, the empress and the heir to the throne lived in the palace. But soon the parents died, and Raph started to bully her, which could not be stopped. The girl begged him to stop it, but the brother wanted to see her obey him. The constant bullying of his sister clearly gave him pleasure. The body was burning, as if the girl had been thrown into a fire, and the brother, striking blow after blow, only demanded that she ask forgiveness for her mistakes. Bitter tears flowed down the princess's face. Celeste did not understand what her fault was, because she lived in a closed room separate from the palace, a quiet life of a hermit. But he seemed not to hear her. There was no longer any strength to resist. The body, tortured by endless beatings, ached, and her brother, a psychopath and sadist, still did not stop. There was no more strength to endure. Celeste simply asked her brother to kill her, but her brother did not understand who would benefit from this. And then she asked him to hit harder, and after such words, the brother's face, swelling with anger, turned red. Cursing at the girl, He squeezed the whip to such an extent that his hands turned white from the tension, and she, still sitting on the floor, did not understand what was the reason for his anger. After all, he had been beating her for 2 months already. The fallen whip, hitting the floor with a dull thud, reminded the beauty that her upbringing was over for today. Looking over her shoulder, she looked at her brother. She saw that the aggression had passed, and she knew that she could catch her breath. And the blonde, suddenly calming down, was already putting himself in order. He was tired of beating his sister, and now he was quietly talking about it. Celeste didn't understand what would follow. But now her brother was reminding her that since the princess was breaking orders, he had no reason to leave her here. And also, looking at the torture device, Raph reported that he had some good news for the girl. And the first news was the ball, which was starting today. Squatting down in front of his sister, he said that as soon as it was over, he would kick her out. But smiling, the Emperor was already asking Celeste what the girl was willing to sacrifice for the sake of the holiday. After all, according to the law, he had to cut off her legs. Looking at her mentally unstable brother, the girl understood that he was quite an actor. But that didn't make it any easier. She knew that terrible grin. After all, it didn't bode well. Celeste's face changed, and the man was amused. The princess screamed and was angry from pain and helplessness. After all, he could simply throw her out, and therefore the girl did not understand why the legs were cut off. But when someone from the imperial family left the palace, they were given status and maintenance. However, now she was punished, and for this, both her feet were cut off. But Raph reminded that since her father was the emperor, the girl could leave the castle with all her limbs intact and also count on maintenance. But not in this case, the brother noted. After all, she had committed a crime and therefore must be punished. But there was one thing. Celeste was the only princess in this country. Trying to touch her with his finger, he confirmed that the girl was one of the best creations of the late emperor. Stroking her cheek, he believed that his sister should not be offended by him. After all, being an illegitimate child is already a great crime. Celeste, pushing away her brother's hand, asked him not to touch her. She dreamed only of taking a bath and eating, and she also did not want to listen to stupid reasoning. However, he, having changed his rhetoric, already asked the princess not to be offended by him. After all, the laws were to blame for everything. But the girl did not choose her fate, and she was offended. Realizing that she had to get out, the beaten beauty looked with horror at the huge number of steps leading up. After all, she had no strength left to walk. Siesta leaned against the walls as she struggled to get up. Her head was spinning because she was hungry, and her legs were completely immobile. As she moved towards the sun, the princess realized that 3 days had already passed since she had been locked in the basement. A ray of sun slid across her pupils. Covering her eyes with her hands, she enjoyed the freedom. The fresh air, filling her lungs with oxygen, gave her hope for life. But she understood that all this was temporary. After all, when the holiday was over, she would lose her feet and the girl would be kicked out. After all, she knew her brother. Standing in the doorway, the girl held her head. She wanted to live so much. However, now Celeste thought that she would never see the sun again. It seemed to her that after rising from the terrible basement, she would gain strength. But only now did the blonde understand how terribly tired she was. Falling onto the cool, soft grass, the princess closed her eyes. She dreamed of only one thing, for her soul and body to calm down. And the earth, like a living organism, tried to bring relief to the girl. Opening her eyes, the blonde realized that she had to figure out how to stay on her feet. The wind whispered in her ears, and the sky breathed above her, trying to dissolve everything that troubled her heart. But the next moment, a dissatisfied voice made her shudder. And the large woman, disturbing the harmony of nature, shouted from afar that it was not right for the princess to lie like that on the grass. But when she came closer, she suddenly began to cry bitterly. After all, through the torn blouse, she could already see the girl's wounded back. The maid said that the medicine needed to be applied quickly. She asked to tell if the blonde was in pain, and she quietly accepted the woman's care and only thanked her. After all, the princess lived alone and there was no one to help her, and only Terega visited her from time to time. But the approaching voices, like dandelion fluff, brought snatches of words to the princess's ears. Celeste listened, for the two were talking about Raph. Walking on the soft grass, the men talked, but it seemed to them that only nature heard them. However, the maid had already said that a guest had come to the princess. The dirty and beaten girl was not at all happy about this event. Lost in thought, Celeste didn't know what to do. After all, she absolutely didn't want to appear in front of people like that. But in the stream of sunlight, two people were already looking at her. One of them, with his arms folded across his chest, clearly had not expected to see such a picture. Trying to get used to the bright sunlight, and in the hope of getting a better look at the men, she raised her hand to her head. The blonde, dressed in a luxurious waistcoat with a coat of arms brooch on his neck, was amazed by the picture he saw, while his companion's eyes reflected only pity, not understanding what these people wanted from her. Celeste was embarrassed, holding her torn blouse. Everything was so untimely, the girl thought. But despite her fatigue, her brain told her that she had never seen these faces. However, she saw that the men's faces had completely different emotions. After all, the blonde man with long hair was looking at her appraisingly. Celeste recognized that look immediately. Perhaps he wanted to examine the princess under the rags. Taking on a menacing look, she already said that one cannot get here without warning. And the man, standing in a stream of leaves swirling in the wind, was already saying that this was not a real princess. Of course, recalling the past 3 days, she herself would not have recognized herself as a princess, she thought, looking into the stranger's eyes. But it was very difficult to humiliate her now. She also stated that if men did invade the princess's space, they should have first introduced themselves. Celeste spoke so loudly that the servant standing behind her cowered in fear, and the beauty was already demanding to know why you came. The blonde, not expecting such pressure, looked at the princess with alarm. Now he understood what people were talking about. After all, she did not have a docile character. But the servant had already introduced Emperor Batiso of the Kalinef Empire, and they learned from Emperor Calix that Celeste was here. The princess lowered her head and changed her anger to mercy, and even tried to apologize for not recognizing the emperor. Only she didn't understand what the hell he was doing here, but she only said that she was not inviting men to come in. Calling Turkin, the emperor said that he was leaving first, and that the servant should catch up with him. However, the maid was already whispering in Celeste's ear that the man owned a huge empire, and the girl should not miss such a chance. But the young man who was eavesdropping on the conversation was already in a hurry to say that the empire of Kalinefe was much larger and much stronger than the empire of Celeste's father. At this point, the princess already understood that no one from the imperial family would come to her just like that. So there had to be a reason. And the next moment, as if reading the girl's thoughts, the emperor's servant asked the beauty to listen to him. Turning around, she looked at the guy carefully, and then said that she was ready to listen to Turkin. And indeed, as it turned out, the emperor had not come to Selena for no reason. After all, he wanted to invite the princess to the ball. The blonde could not believe her ears. Clenching her hands into a fist, she became excited. Already knowing that the empire of Kalinef was more powerful than Calix, she understood that there was a chance to get out of this swamp. Could it be that fate, in the person of Emperor Batiso, had given her a man who could defeat Raf, the princess thought, looking at the man. Looking over the young man's shoulder, Celeste did not understand where the emperor was heading. However, driven by the wind, he was already moving towards the thicket. His steps were quick but almost inaudible, as if the very ground beneath him was retreating, making way. But now the princess did not understand how the man who just a few minutes ago said that he had come especially to see her was now leaving. But the young man, noticing her sadness, asked the princess not to be upset. He promised to take the girl to the ball instead of Mr. Batiso. Extending his hand, he introduced himself. After all, he had completely forgotten that he had not done it officially. Placing his palm on his chest, the young man already said that his name was Turkin, and that he was accompanying his master. She liked this smiling and courteous young man at first sight. After all, she had never met such pleasant people in her life. Frozen in place, the princess was already asking how to address him. But Turkin said that simply by his first name, because he had neither a surname nor a rank. However, after he offered the girl his hand, he no longer seemed like an ordinary person to her. And now the princess did not believe that he did not have a title. The emperor's servant exuded a noble nature. After all, he was very well-mannered and also well-dressed. And even though the girl knew so little about the world, looking at such a person, one could say that he was an aristocrat. At some point, Turkin felt that the princess wanted to ask about something. Perhaps something important and personal. But suddenly she turned away abruptly, and the guy kept looking and looking at her, without taking his eyes off her. However, his warm smile only caused questions in the girl. But a minute later, his hand was already reaching for the princess's frightened face. The fear reflected in Celeste's soul and eyes only reminded her that the girl had thought well of him in vain. But the thought that came to her in time that perhaps she had not seen people for a long time calmed her down a little. And Turkin's hand was already touching the princess's hair. The girl shuddered, and the young man, still smiling, continued to look at her as if he saw a person he had long missed. But the next moment the brunette was already removing the leaf that had unexpectedly landed on the princess's luxurious hair. He did it so carefully, as if afraid to disturb the very air around the girl. Laughing, he showed her the find. But the girl, suddenly realizing how wild she had become lately, looked at him with shame. Her face darkened. Her insides sank. She scolded herself for her sudden fear. It was just a polite gesture. Looking at the sheet, the young man smiled, and Celeste suddenly realized how much she wanted someone to look at her the same way. Walking through the garden, the servant reminded the princess again that there was a ball in the castle today. But judging by the girl's confused face, Tekin understood that she did not know about it. The princess was worried. Perhaps that's why she forgot that Raf had told her about it. But out loud she only answered that she didn't see the need to know everything. However, turning his head slightly, the young man already said that perhaps he shouldn't tell her everything. Clutching her dress, Celeste thought that apparently other empires already knew about her. But she had no idea that the king could come to visit her personally. The blonde did not hide the fact that they most likely knew about her situation. And now Turkin was only saying that she and Mr. Batizo were in completely different situations. But suddenly the young man stopped. He again expressed Batizo's wishes to go to the ball with the princess. Even though the emperor had left her, the invitation still stood, Turkin added with a smile. Well, judging by the girl's face, she didn't trust anyone. At that moment, Celeste suddenly remembered that Raf was going to cut off his sister's legs and kick her out of the empire. However now, remembering her brother's behavior, the beauty could not understand what had to happen for him to change his mind. And now, looking at the emperor's servant, the princess tried to find an answer. But she had one more question for the young man. After all, she had absolutely no idea what she would wear to the ball. The princess had long been as poor as a stationary mouse, and Turka, smiling again, informed the girl that there was absolutely no need to worry about this. After all, a man would soon come to her who would bring a dress. He promised that the girl would look gorgeous. He was also sure that the princess would soon forget about the clothes she was currently wearing. It was like a dream. She did not believe yet that her life could change. However, the young man was saying goodbye, but he promised that he would accompany the princess to the ball. But she asked the guy to stay for a couple more minutes. After all, there was a question that was bothering her. Taking a deep breath and clasping her hands, she was already asking whether Mr. Raf would give his consent to this. Turkin's changed gaze did not escape her, and for a moment Celeste thought that there would be no answer. But the very next moment the young man said that they absolutely did not need anyone's consent for this. After all, it was an order from Mr. Batizo, the servant reminded, looking piercingly at the princess. And now his smiling eyes looked as if it had suddenly become cold on a clear day. And the girl did not yet understand what was behind it. But she was already letting the young man go, closing herself off and thinking. After all, she was terribly afraid of her brother, who, as it turned out, had not even been asked. Lost in her thoughts, Celeste realized that she could be drawn into something much more than just court intrigue. However, now it seemed to her that she only knew that Batizo was stronger than her brother. But this did not make the blonde feel any better. The modest house in which the princess lived could hardly be called a decent home. But the surrounding nature always supported the spirit of the beauty. But now, taking the dress out of the box tied with blue ribbons, the princess could not believe her eyes. The luxurious outfit, embroidered with rhinestones, pearls, and gold threads delivered by a messenger, was already lying on Celeste's bed. But would it suit her? The girl wondered. But the servant asked her not to think about it. After all, the seamstress had even made sure that the outfit had long sleeves. Without wasting any time and quickly hiding behind the screen, the beauty was already throwing off her worn-out junk. And despite the fact that her back was burning from the beatings, the princess asked Teregi about Emperor Kalanev. Trying to see Celeste, the maid stood on her tiptoes and peered through the screen. The man was called Black Wings, she said, not understanding the meaning of these words. Being a great warrior, the servants continued, he was known for his desire to expand his territories. Fastening the pearl belt on her thin waist, the princess realized that she knew absolutely nothing about her country. It must have been big, since it came to war. But the next moment the princess was already asking Toregu to help her button the buttons on her back. Coming out from behind the screen, it was noticeable that the girl was worried, wanting to make sure that she had put everything on correctly. After all, there were no mirrors in the house, but the maid, calling upon the Almighty and having lost the gift of speech, could not take her eyes off Celeste. And she only embarrassedly asked about what she had done wrong. The maid always knew that the princess was beautiful, but the dress miraculously emphasized the refinement that neither poverty nor pain could hide. While buttoning her buttons, Torega grumbled. Not only did the girl have to live in exile, but the constant beatings were poisoning the beauty's life. But at that very moment, the blonde didn't want to think about it. After all, the beautiful dress was already lifting her spirits. She tried to pull herself together. She knew for sure that now was not the time to wallow in sadness. But something, at the instinctive level, was bothering the princess. And the approaching evening, illuminating the sky with terracotta colors, announced that a special event would soon take place in the girl's life. And the one who was supposed to take her to the ball was already standing at the door of Celeste's house. With his hands behind his back, as if trying to contain his excitement, Turkin was thinking. The door creaked open. Turning around, the young man looked in surprise at the rare beauty who had appeared in the doorway. She had already asked how long he had been waiting for her, and the emperor's servant, unable to look away, enjoyed the truly wonderful transformation. Without hiding his delight, the servant spoke frankly about how he had never seen such a beauty, and also about how clothes change a person, inviting him to lead the princess into the world of dance and music, good mood and luxurious outfits. Turkin was already extending his hand to her. Holding the young man by the arm, the princess was nervous, and he only continued to shower Celeste with compliments, filling her with confidence. Mixed feelings of anxiety and foreboding did not leave the girl. After all, she understood that the time had come to decide what to do with her life. The luxurious palace, ornately rising with its peaks into the night sky, emphasizes the wealth and vanity of its owner with amazing fireworks. The princess screamed. After all, she had long forgotten what the mansion looked like, but now it seemed completely different to the blonde. Not like in the days of her childhood. She couldn't get enough of it, because the palace loudly declared its power and showed ostentatious hospitality, lighting candles in every window. Even as a child, Selena was not allowed to enter it, because the aristocratic families were against it, and Turkin had already noted that the princess had a problem with expressing emotions. After all, members of the imperial family must express admiration very quietly, he added. Moreover, they had to keep their lips tightly compressed, the servant said, and not move them while talking and eating. But Celeste, frowning, thought only that she had not been taught this. Realizing how much the young man knew about etiquette, she felt subordinate to him, and the open patterned doors were already letting an unusual couple into the castle. The crowd turned around, and a quiet whisper rolled through the room. The princess, squeezing her shoulders, opened her eyes wide. After all, for the girl who had lived in seclusion for many years, now everything was new. But the aristocrats who were staring at them, already going beyond the etiquette that praised Turkin, looked at her with disdain. While discussing how real the princess was, they didn't even notice how they forgot about decency. Moreover, some didn't even recognize the girl. My head was spinning, and it was so difficult to breathe that it seemed like the next moment there wouldn't be enough air. However, the young man's voice, breaking through the princess's doubts and shame, told her to straighten her back. Moreover, the young man asked the princess to stop looking at him all the time. And what the young man said next shocked her. After all, she had to raise the corners of her lips and show a bearing that Celeste had never heard of. But raising her nose and straightening her back, the beauty already felt how the shoes began to rub her feet. However, the emperor's exit was already announced. Raph, sitting leisurely in his chair, looked at the guests, and the butler reported that Celeste had come to the ball. The luxurious white waistcoat, embroidered with gold threads, suited the blonde man amazingly, and the skillfully framed sapphire was the main decoration of the emperor's costume. Coming closer, the couple greeted Raph, but he was already carefully examining his sister's appearance. He was upset by the fact that the girl was so beautiful. He propped his cheek up with his fist, making it clear that he was bored, but nevertheless wanted Celeste to have a good time, and she, looking at her brother, already noted that he had already thought of something. After all, she had studied the sadist's facial expressions for many years. Only one thing remained a mystery. After all, the girl did not see Mr. Batiso. However, the cheerful laughter that rang out had already made her pay attention to the aperitif table, which was bursting with delicious desserts. But suddenly her gaze froze. After all, she was already being watched. Celeste felt it piercing her. Raising a glass of red wine to his lips, the Emperor looked at her with sad eyes. There was something appraising in his gaze, but not repulsive. Looking at him, Celeste tried to guess what reaction he was expecting. The beauty did not know how to talk to a man who at first glance seemed so calm. There was not a single idea in her head on how to lasso a man. However, there was a sharp, almost painful feeling that she had to act. And the next minute, a rustling sound behind her distracted the girl from her thoughts. And it was Turkin who was trying to say something in her ear. Listening, she already heard the servant advise the princess to propose to the Emperor. Not for love or the future, but for salvation. It was so humiliating and sad that Celeste was horrified. The princess felt like she would faint from shame. But the same advisor insisted that this was the only way to leave Calix and save his life. What was happening seemed like a dream to Celeste. After all, the beauty had been taught to hide, obey, and endure all her life. And now she had to act. And the Emperor's servant, not allowing the girl to retreat, insisted that it was time to make a winning move. The princess tried to understand how he knew that she wanted to leave this place. It seemed to her as if Turkin saw right through her. However, Celeste doubted that the Emperor would accept her proposal. After all, they were complete strangers. But the servant insistently said that the girl must make it so that the Emperor could not refuse her. But Turkin did not retreat. He only said that he would offer an option, but the princess had to do the rest. The narrow shoe was squeezing her foot so much that she couldn't stand it anymore. But suddenly it dawned on her why he had suddenly suggested that she do this. However, Turkin had already cut her off abruptly. Looking at the Emperor, the servant noted that Celeste was asking too many questions and was not trying to find answers. Concentrating, the blonde understood that it was time to act. And now the only thing that mattered was whether the girl could become the Empress of Kalinef. As she headed towards the Emperor, she thought about how satisfied the man would be with her proposal. And Mr. Batiso, still looking at the princess, calmly poured red wine into his glass. But Celeste, quickening her pace, was already thinking that he would hardly be able to refuse her. After all, what Batiso wanted, the Emperor of the most powerful country wanted. After all, the country of Black Wings Kalinef, which the girl knew about from the words of the maid, was a powerful state that was still expanding. And now, remembering Raf, who sat there with a dissatisfied face, it didn't look like it was he who invited Batiso. Now she understood that everything was completely the opposite. And that is why the imposed ball did not please her brother at all. And the princess was already approaching the table, generously served with sweets. The terribly nervous beauty tried to start a conversation. And Batiso, noticing this, hurried to invite the girl to the table. He understood that the girl wanted to tell him something. Otherwise, she would not have come up to him. Curtsying, Celeste thanked the Emperor for the invitation. But she already understood that he wanted the girl to sit opposite him, leaving the place next to him free. He apparently wanted to keep his distance. And the princess was already noting the young man's perfect appearance. Sitting down, the blonde thought about how to start the conversation. And her confused look was already attracting the Emperor. Seeing a new guest at the table, the service staff hurried to serve additional cutlery. Without wasting time, Mr. Batiso began the conversation. He asked about what question the beauty wanted to ask him. But the girl seemed not to hear the Emperor. It was hard for her to imagine how he would take what the blonde was about to offer him. After all, she didn't have the subtleties of the palace game. All she had was determination, and even that abandoned the princess. But after taking a deep breath, Celeste quickly proposed marriage to the Emperor. This proposal was unexpected, the Emperor noted. And the princess, who sensed the notes of sarcasm in his words, wanted to run away. Having closed his eyes and smiling, Batiso was already reproaching the girl. After all, first the beauty asked him why he had come, and then she proposed marriage. But the princess, with her eyes downcast and not knowing where to hide from shame, looked at the empty plate, while the Emperor noted her amazing appearance. Having grown a little bolder, she was already reminding him that if he married her, he would get this country. It was a bold statement, Batiso noted, his eyes flashing angrily. And then, looking menacingly at her point blank, he already claimed that now Princess Calix was offering his country to him. The man smiled as he brought the glass to his mouth. The warrior found it funny to hear the princess's proposal, who moreover had long since been excommunicated from the court. But then he suddenly laughed loudly. After all, the glory of the emperor preceded his greatness. However, the princess did not give in. Having gathered her courage, she already asked the emperor whether he really wanted to give up Calyx. But the man, continuing to twirl the glass in his hand, was already saying that the girl did not understand who he was. It seemed that Celeste had lifted his spirits. For the next moment he was already saying that he could get Calyx even without marrying her. After all it took was a talk with his emperor. But the princess didn't think Ralph would give up his country. Well, maybe just some unnecessary piece of it. And she was already in a hurry to voice her thought. After all, the blonde understood that Belizo most likely had other intentions, which meant there would be war and casualties. And even if he wins the war, the girl continued, looking at the expression on the emperor's face, the losses will still be significant. But suddenly her gaze changed. After all, Celeste, smiling, had already offered to help the emperor get Calyx without any losses for Kalinef. In her heart, she was proud of herself. After all, she thought that she had already made a worthy proposal to the man, quite selflessly. Pouring another glass of wine, Batiso smirked. After all, he believed that people like the princess did not particularly value his country. However, the girl, lowering her eyes again, reminded him that he knew her situation. And these were not rumors that her brother was constantly bullying her. Looking tenderly at Emperor Batiso, she assumed that, having entered his country as empress, she would be able to love it as he did. Knowing that she didn't know how to drink at all, she slowly brought the glass to her mouth. The girl liked the smell of the drink. She even tried to understand what it was made of. It seemed that the emperor had taken a pause. After all, the princess already felt his detachment, and Celeste didn't like it. And although she understood little about negotiations, she already saw that the emperor had a talent for putting people in awkward positions. A minute later, the blonde was talking about how Celeste wouldn't help him get Calyx, but she only quietly retorted that she would help if the man let her. Changing the subject of the conversation, the emperor already said that he saw that she was claiming to become the empress of Kalinef. But the girl was too young, he noted, and the busy emperor had absolutely no time to teach her, and there was a lot to learn. However, the stubborn princess was already ready for anything. He abruptly put the glass down on the table, doubting, especially since his demands were quite specific. Squinting his eyes, the emperor was already saying that Celeste didn't even know what she would have to learn, and the serious-minded girl, realizing that the option she proposed only made him laugh. But she dreamed of only one thing, that Batizo would agree. Snorting and chuckling, the blonde thought. He liked her confidence, and now he was thinking about how he hadn't even noticed this quality in her at first glance. But raising his glass, he insisted that Celeste keep the promise she made at this table. The princess smiled. She may have looked a little silly at that moment, but inside she was jubilant, because she felt that she had succeeded. The ringing of glasses, a high note, swept through the hall, sealing the blonde's promise. Celeste rejoiced, assuring that she would be able to keep her word, and the emperor's servant, who was behind the curtain, already heard her joyful laughter and the emperor's soft voice. Looking at the princess, he rejoiced. After all, he already understood that everything was going according to a clearly thought-out plan, the author of which was he. Despite the late hour, the sky above the castle was blazing with hundreds of lights. Fireworks scratching the night were scattered like jewels on black velvet. Catching her breath, the blonde slowly walked through the castle courtyard. She was glad that everything worked out, afraid to even think about how it could have been different. But the next moment, a piercing pain stopped Celeste. The princess was so worried that she didn't even notice how badly she had rubbed her feet. I didn't understand how this happened. Because she walked so little during the ball, the girl approached the bench near the fountain, and now she wanted to take a closer look at what had happened to her leg. Lifting her dress, the princess sighed heavily. It seemed that the girl, accustomed to pain, should not have paid attention to such trifles at all. But when she took off her shoe, the blonde could already see that her entire foot was on fire. This upset the girl, because she didn't understand how she would get home now. However, the next moment the man's shadow was already covering her wounded limb. The emperor's servant, who appeared as if from under the ground, already made the princess shudder. I don't understand how she didn't notice him. The girl asked him not to do that again, and the young man, smiling, was already saying that he had tried to talk to her, but Celeste was so carried away that she did not hear him. Turkin saw that the girl had a problem with her shoes, but the princess asked him not to pay attention to such a trifle. However, raising her head, she already wanted to ask something of the emperor's servant. The young man was not against trying to win Celeste over. The girl felt that he was more than a servant to his master. And now Celeste assumed that most likely Mr. Batiso knew that the girl would propose marriage to him. Turkin did not deny it, but he hardly knew the young man noted that she would propose to him calyx. Was it really only this proposal that decided her fate? Celeste wondered. But the young man, being in a great mood, was already saying that this was most likely the case. The princess closed her eyes and sighed. After all, it was perfectly understandable that Batiso was checking her. After all, the matter was so urgent that there were no other options, and now all the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. After all, the reason why Mr. Batiso came here and even the upcoming wedding were most likely Turkin's plan. The young man, smiling broadly, said only that he only partially took part in this event. But when she thought about it, she already understood that when Turkin proposed marriage, he knew that Celeste would want to give up calyx as well. She suddenly felt so sick at the thought that the young man could see right through her. Even more, she was like a pawn on a chessboard. Holding his leg, she asked the young man to move away from her, citing fatigue. Although she had long noticed that she got tired when he was nearby, he glanced at the emperor's servant for a second. She was already reminding him that he also needed to rest. But he wasn't tired at all, Turkin thought. The princess sought the strength within herself to get up and walk home, but her leg ached terribly. Suddenly, Turkin leaned over and extended his hand towards her leg. The girl shuddered in surprise. Celeste demanded that the man take his hands off. However, he was already apologizing, because he knew that it was her first time wearing shoes, but he did not think that she would hurt her feet so much. However, the princess was already simply screaming that she felt great and asked to be left alone. Having shown his character, he calmly told her not to twitch. After all, Turkin intended to accompany her and treat her as befits a princess. "Do all members of the imperial family have to have escorts?" the princess asked snappingly. She pretended that she was worried about the moment that they would be seen together. But continuing to smile, the young man was already saying that he did not see anyone. The princess lowered her eyes and thought that this guy was just her subordinate, and therefore she could do whatever she wanted with him. But something stopped the girl. After all, he tried to do everything to make the beauty feel better, and she already felt it after the massage. But the voices that were heard had already refuted Turkin's spontaneous statement that no one came here. The tender beauty, clinging to her admirer, praised him for finding a wonderful place, and the observers sitting behind the fountain did not know what to do. Without thinking twice, Turkin was already pointing his finger at a tree growing in the park. After all, it was the only place they could hide behind. Stealthily making their way through the thickets of bushes, the strange couple tried not to give themselves away. However, from the side they could observe the couple in love. And now the girl, clinging to the young man, was worried that they could be seen. But the partner was already calming the beauty, telling Turkin, as he had told her earlier, that there were no people here. In a fit of passion, he was already hugging her, stroking her intimate places and unbuttoning her dress on the back. Covering her mouth with her hands, the princess did not understand how to behave. She had never seen anything like this, and she vaguely understood what would follow. Turning away from the terrible picture, she puffed out her cheeks in fear, refusing to believe what was happening. It was unclear why, but she felt ashamed. And now she dreamed only of getting out as quickly as possible and not listening to these sounds. Noticing the princess's embarrassment, Turkin was already gently but firmly covering the girl's ears, realizing how pure and innocent she was. And Celeste, pressed against the tree trunk, looked into the young man's eyes with great gratitude. Turkin's touch excited her, but she didn't want such care from a man, and he only wanted to spare her from such sounds. Looking towards the couple in love, he understood that the young people were going further and further in their impulses, satisfying mutual desires. And now he was telling Celeste, who was extremely confused and clenched her fists tightly on her chest, that the young people had not yet left. Turkin was so close to her that the girl could feel his breath. Now the princess understood why Turkin always scared her. After all, he always looked at her point blank, although the girl understood that he had no feelings for her. However, Celeste had already noted his pleasant appearance, as well as the completely unusual color of his eyes. After all, it was the first time in my life that I saw such red eyes up close. It was very beautiful, although sometimes frightening. But the next moment the princess forbade thinking about him. After all, she knew about Turkin's ability to read minds. Well, no matter how she tried to do it, it still returned to her blonde head. And the heart, which the girl could now clearly hear, was beating as if she was running somewhere. But the young man, having finally opened the princess's ears, was already saying that the couple had left. Looking into the princess's eyes, he did not understand whether she heard him or not, and the girl, as if deaf, looked at the guy attentively. But lowering her eyes, she already accepted the fact that taking care of her was his responsibility. Having risen, the princess was already hurrying to return to the castle. And Turkin, looking at the sad look of the beauty, already understood how much it hurt her to walk. However, he did not know how often the girl moved despite the pain. And now, taking her hands in herself again, Celeste said that she wanted to walk on the contrary. Never ceasing to be amazed by the strength and resilience of the young woman, the emperor's servant did not take his eyes off her. She bent down and tried to shake off the hem of her dress. But the brunette, getting ahead of the girl, was already reminding her that this was also part of his duties. I held out my hand and he advised me to hurry, because they could be noticed in the palace. Now Celeste didn't know at all if she could trust him. There was no lie in him. But she didn't feel the truth either. But he was the only person who was next to her. And so, without thinking, she extended her hand to the young man. Moving through the huge garden, Turkin promised the princess to talk about the wedding when the ball was over. And she, realizing that everything was happening very quickly, only sighed quietly. Just a few minutes later, sitting over a cup of tea, Emperor Batiso suggested that the wedding be held as quickly as possible. Looking at the couple sitting opposite him, he noted that this was the first union of Kalinef and Calix, and therefore he did not want to slow things down. But Raf, representing the princess, was already nervous. And the girl, despite knowing about this conversation, looked confused. Batizo noted that Celeste's brother was clearly not happy about this news, and he only said that he was very surprised. He closed his eyes and hurried to say that he wanted to spend everything in Kalinef. The imperial family would send congratulations, but would not participate themselves. However, the smiling blonde was surprised by such a decision. But realizing that the wedding was just a pretext, he was ready to accept such conditions. Looking at the princess, Raf noted that he would also like to hold this event on a grand scale. However, he could not do this, said the sadist, looking sympathetically at his sister. Putting his hand on her and pretending to be genuinely sorry, Emperor Kalines reminded her that he could do nothing about the princess's low origins. However, Batizo has already said that this does not bother him at all. After all, the girl is beautiful as spring, and that is quite enough. And Raf was already covered in red spots. Trying to catch his breath and come up with something new, he was already calling the servants. He asked to replace the tea, noting that the drink poured into the cups had completely cooled down. After all, this tea is supplied only to the imperial family from Karsa, which is to the east of the sea, the blonde noted. When Batiso suggested trying the drink, he emphasized that it was only supplied to the empire of Calix. However, the emperor, ignoring his opponent's boasting, only continued to carefully examine Celeste. Noticing this, Raf was already asking how much the guest liked the drink, and the seated blonde, trying tea for the first time, only felt a simple, herbal taste. However, Batiso reminded the emperor that he would not try the drink according to special principles. Pushing the cup away, he did not hide the fact that he only eats and drinks what is prepared at his home. Blushing, he admitted that he always tries to be vigilant, and over many years he has developed this rule. However, Raf, who looked at him, already noted that this was a wise decision, and the princess already saw that her brother was being cautious in front of the blonde. Of course, this was a forced marriage, the girl thought, but for her it was the right path. Returning home, she took out her suitcase. While packing her modest belongings, Celeste couldn't get over the joy of going to Kalinef the very next day, and now she asked the maid if she would go with her. The woman was not against it, because she could not let the princess go to an unfamiliar place without an escort. She loved the princess so much that she had already said that even if Celeste were to die, she would die next to her. And she hurried to thank the servants. Hugging the woman tightly, the beauty thought that if it weren't for her, the princess would have gone crazy in this basement long ago. However, the joy did not last long, because the next moment the door suddenly opened. Celeste shuddered. Her brother, standing on the threshold, was speaking in a familiar tone about how glad he was to death that his sister was leaving. He was almost growling, and the beauty saw that Raf was very drunk. He was wondering how his illegitimate sister managed to persuade the emperor to marry her. Looking at the flushed man, Celeste made excuses. She assumed that perhaps the man simply liked her, but he, already waving his arms, was telling that very beautiful women lived in Kalinef, and so he did not understand how someone like her, how she could be liked. Although what did he expect from the princess after all? Her mother was exactly the same, Raf added. And she not only deceived the emperor, but also had affairs with everyone in sight. And now the emperor even doubted that she was a princess. But the girl asked to stop this terrible conversation. However, a minute later she already regretted that she had made a remark to Raf. She asked him to return to the castle, and he, insulting and humiliating the girl, claimed that the aristocrats in Kalinef would hardly accept her. However, the woman clenching her fists boldly said that she did not care whether she became empress. And suddenly, having become completely bold, the princess was already shouting about how it was important for her now to leave this hell, and also to forget the one she hated so much. He didn't even doubt that the girl was thinking about it, and without holding back he attacked the princess with his fists. Celeste crouched down and covered herself with her hands, and Raf kept hitting her. But at some point she suddenly realized that the man had stopped beating her. But the next moment he was already attacking Terega. The maid fell, and Celeste covered her eyes with her hands in fear. Well, the aggressive emperor went completely wild and didn't understand what right a commoner had to stop him. He kicked the woman in the head and shouted that no one dared stop him, and the stupid princess deserved to be killed by him. The maid moaned, and the brave Celeste, covering the girl, begged the emperor to stop. But he, having entered into a frenzy, no longer hurt anyone, only by delivering blow after blow, but this time on the back of the princess covering Terega, did he receive pleasure. But the maid lying underneath her was already asking the blonde to get off her. She was asking Raf for forgiveness and was talking about him beating her. Blood was oozing from the princess's unhealed wounds. It was unknown how this story would have ended, but two people were already entering the girl's house, which Raf had not expected at all, and they were amazed by what they saw. Now they understood with their own eyes the process of raising a princess. The disheveled Raf, knowing that he had found himself in a rather awkward situation, changed his anger to mercy. He also asked Batizo how he had ended up in this house, and the emperor, looking at the terrible picture, did not understand whether he needed to see all this. After all, Celeste, lifting the maid from the floor, was sobbing. She already dreamed that the beatings would never be repeated, but not even 2 days had passed. But the moral monster only laughed, speaking about the small skirmish he had with his sister. He regretted that the men had to see it. However, he again asked the emperor why he had come here at such a time. Batizo did not hide that he had come to talk to his bride. Sadness flashed through Raf's eyes. After all, he had been so upset, the young man added when he learned that his sister was leaving. Without stopping, she continued to play the comedy, saying that emotions simply overwhelmed him. At this moment, the princess looked at her brother with disapproval. After all, he had to teach a lesson to the servant who had spoiled the emperor's mood, Raf added. Turkin looked at his master with horror, while the man continued to play the jester without stopping. But Emperor Kalinefa noted that such behavior was not appropriate for a man of his level, recalling that the princess's brother was always distinguished by his long excuses. Looking at the girl and raising his hand, Batizo said that perhaps everything was as he said. But everything looked completely different. After all, the imperial family in Calix, which was so proud of its dignity, always punished its subordinates. He asked to be left alone with Celeste if Raf was already finished with the massacre. After all, he needed to talk to his bride. The emperor did not like being told what to do. However, now, clenching his fists, the emperor was not against leaving them for a conversation. Wishing the bloody princess sweet dreams, the sadist left her haven. Moving abruptly and chaotically, he simply ran past Emperor Kalinev, but lifting the maid and looking after her brother. Celeste already doubted how drunk he was. After all, he very quickly submitted to Batizo. Holding the beaten servant, the blonde thanked the emperor for intervening. And now Celeste asked what the man wanted to talk to her about. But Batizo calmly reported that tomorrow they would be leaving for Kalinev. He did not hide that the road ahead was long. And even if he traveled without rest, the emperor continued, it would take about 15 days. However, pointing to Turkin, he said that thanks to him they would spend from a week to 10 days on the road. Celeste, who looked back at that moment, did not quite understand what role the emperor's servant could play in time. And it will be necessary to go, even if the princess falls ill, the emperor added. The disheveled and beaten beauty agreed, realizing that he was not consulting her, but presenting her with a fait accompli. But she did not yet know whether she could hold out for 10 days. However, the emperor was already in a hurry to leave the uncomfortable room, considering the conversation over. Nodding towards Turkin, he said goodbye. The men disappeared so quickly that the girls only had time to bow. But now one of them thought that she was ready to do anything for freedom. But as soon as the door closed, Celeste could not shake the feeling that Mr. Batiso was looking at her with pity. However, even if this was the case, the beauty recalled, there was nothing she could do about it yet. The morning slowly descended on the mortal earth. The air was so clear that it seemed as if nature itself, holding its breath, wanted to say goodbye to Celeste. Turkin, who had come for the princess, had already said that the carriage was ready, and the maid was already hurrying to carry things into it. The princess, dressed in a yellow travel suit, holding a suitcase in front of her, was already in a hurry to say that there weren't many things, so Terega would manage quickly. Taking the suitcase from the girl, Turkin accidentally pinched her finger. The princess, screaming in surprise, blushed, but quickly coming to her senses, she thanked the servant. However, he again reminded the blonde that members of the royal family should not thank servants. Turkin quickly glanced at the princess and said that for them this was work. The girl was grateful to him, because no one had ever taught her etiquette, but he saw that in addition to the suitcase in her hands, the princess was holding a small travel bag. Quickly snatching that one from the girl's hands, the emperor's servant reminded her that this was also his job. Forgetting the brunette's instructions, Celeste hurried to thank him again. But looking at Turkin, she already noticed his menacing gaze and disappointed look. The man reminded her again that she shouldn't admire out loud. This also applied to gratitude. The princess blushed, and now she remembered that before leaving Calix she had met with her brother and the aristocracy. Raf, opening his arms wide, lamented that she was leaving. She felt the falseness that emanated from the members of the royal family. But most of all, she remembered Raf's strange words of farewell. After all, he, leaning very close to his sister, asked her to save herself. It was disgusting for her to hear such words. After all, the Inspirator had been mocking her for several years. And then, but very quietly, approaching her ear, he spoke about how she must survive in Kalinefi. Seeing the princess's frightened look, the moral freak smiled, and the thoughtful Selena did not understand why such warnings. But pulling herself together and raising her eyes, she looked at his brother with hatred. She promised him that she would definitely survive, and when she returned to Calix, she would definitely deal with her mother's death. The luxurious palace, the existence of which she had forgotten before meeting Batiso, was already seeing off its illegitimate heiress. However, leaving him, she mentally asked Raf to wait for her, since it was to him that she had the most questions. It was the 12th day since the princess had left Calix. The imperial carriage moved slowly through the forest. Looking through the window, the guard was already suggesting that the princess take a rest and then move on. Having set the table, the maid asked Celeste to eat. After all, she needed strength, and the pie, asparagus, and a piece of cheese were more than welcome. Caring Terega was worried that the princess had a hard time riding in a carriage because of the wounds on her back, but the girl reminded her that she had taken her medicine. But suddenly a familiar voice said that Celeste was healthier than he thought. Raising her eyes, the girl already saw Mr. Batizo. With his arms folded across his chest, the emperor worried about Celeste's health and asked if the medications were helping. Being pleased with the appearance of her future husband, after several days of travel, she already answered with a smile that she was very persistent. Looking at the forest surrounding them, Batiso was already reporting that in 3 more days they would safely reach Kalinef. Extending his hand, he added that, as he had said earlier, Turkin would take care of everything from now on. After all, he completely forgot to tell her that he was a wizard of space and time. And also, the man added with a sigh that if there had been fewer escorts, they would have long ago been transported to Kalinef directly from Calix. Holding the dishes in her hands, the princess did not understand what he was talking about. After all, she believed that wizards did not exist in this world. But sighing, Mr. Batiso informed the girl that it would be difficult for him to explain this. After all, the servant told him that she had not even received a basic education. Smiling, he repeated again that the girl would indeed have to learn a lot. However, Selena did not know what to answer. Lowering her head, the princess promised that she would try, and her future husband was already leaving. She was sad, and even a little hurt, but she understood that getting closer to him would not be easy. After all, the girl, like last time, thought that he was some kind of heartless, and now, looking at the back of the retreating emperor, she was visited by various thoughts. But one thing was absolutely clear, because they were as different as heaven and earth. It seemed that the long journey would never end. Carriages and carts, slowly moving through forests and fields, carried tired companions. Terega was sleeping, and the princess, exhausted by pain, lost track of time. After all her ointments and painkillers had long since run out, and her strength was leaving her. But suddenly the driver stopped the horses. The sounds died down, and people's conversations began to fill the space. The princess, looking out the window, saw that the journey was not yet over. So why there was a stop, she did not yet understand. However, she had already heard a familiar voice, which said that from here they would travel through space and time. But the people surrounding the wizard, seeing how he activated the fireball, were already asking him if he would really do it here. The awakened maid began to cry, and the princess, clinging to the carriage window, was already asking her to calm down, because now they would witness a miracle. And Terega hurried to report that she was seeing a wizard for the first time in her life. After all, keeping a magician, the servants assumed, was probably a very expensive pleasure. But suddenly everything around started spinning. The magic ball, spinning energy, pulled people, horses, and carts into its huge funnel. The princess, closing her eyes, already felt a strong headache, but it did not last long. After all, in just a minute the flow of energy, like a wild river, breaking through the border, was already throwing objects and people into the courtyard of the imperial castle. The space flared with light and the air hummed with tension. Reality shook. Opening her eyes, Celeste could not believe what was happening. She couldn't even imagine, living in her miserable little house, that such miracles exist in the world. The girl thought in delight. And now, looking at the majestic palace of Kalanef, she already understood that it was so large that it inspired more fear than she had imagined. And Turkin was already looking in the carriage window, and the smiling princess was glad to see him, because she had not even imagined that he had such a talent. Opening the carriage door, the emperor's servant said that they had arrived, and he was glad that the princess was okay. And now he invited the girl to go to Mr. Batiso. After all, the assembled nobility already wanted to see Princess Celeste. The beauty was scared. She felt that the gazes riveted on the future empress would be strict, and the story of her origin did not give the blonde any peace. But there was nothing to be done, because she herself had offered herself for this role. She saw how her hands were shaking, and she understood that she was more nervous than at the ball. However, Turkin, seeing the girl's condition, asked her to calm down, and there was genuine concern in his voice. Holding out his hand to the princess, he could already feel the trembling in her small palm. Turkin asked the girl to think about how she was shaking from the weather. Once again, Celeste was grateful to him. After all, she understood that she would hardly have coped with all the events if not for his care. Putting her hand into Turkin's, she felt how hot it was, and he, remembering her brother, reminded her that no one would hurt her here. The princess was faceless. Again encouraging the princess, he asked her to behave as befits a member of the imperial family, decisively and boldly. And after some time, Turkin pompously announced to the curious nobility that he was glad to introduce them to the future empress of Kalanef. After all, the emperor's chosen one was Princess Celeste, born in Calix. The blonde was slightly nervous but tried to cheer herself up internally. And now the princess, looking at her subjects and the huge palace, tried to believe that all this was reality and not an illusion. Realizing how tired the girl was on the way, Batiso already asked the maid to show the room in which the princess would live until the wedding. What she saw amazed the beauty. Now it seemed to the blonde that she had died and gone to heaven. After all, the pearl garlands hanging from the carved headboard of the bed quietly rang out like the music of dreams. Without ceasing to admire the room, she already remembered Turkin's words that after the wedding she would settle in the marital chambers. However, the maid had already announced that the bathing water was ready, and the princess had no choice but to follow her. And the girl had already reminded her that the emperor was waiting for her for dinner after bathing. Of course she would like to rest, but she was in no position to refuse. Having undressed, the girl sat down in the bath. However, out of the corner of her eye she watched as the excited maids were horrified by what they saw. The princess's back was mutilated. Horrible scars, blue and red, covering her tender body, remained as a memory of recent events. Feeling that the maids were confused, she remained silent. After all, their faces reflected questions that could not be hidden. Feeling that it was time to lighten the mood, Celeste asked to pass her a washcloth, and one of the maids was already talking about applying ointment to the girl's back. Clutching the washcloth to herself, she caught herself thinking that she wanted to thank the servant again. Washing her hands, she thought about Batiso. After all, she had long wanted to talk to him alone. Having relaxed, the girl wanted to rest, but the emperor was waiting for her. And after some time, Celeste was sitting at a huge black table. The luxurious blue dress surprisingly matched her blue eyes. Falling asleep from fatigue, the girl did not understand why the emperor was late. After all, she had been waiting for him for a long time. The wait seemed like an eternity, and only the old wooden clock striking every minute reminded that time exists. But suddenly the heavy doors covered with golden monograms opened slightly. In the stream of light, the princess tried to see the person entering. Despite her fatigue, she looked surprisingly fresh. But now Celeste was thinking only about meeting Batiso. However, it was not destined to happen. After all, the princess had already seen Turkin, who only looked at her with confusion. The princess did not understand why he invited her if he himself did not intend to come. But Tarkin, anticipating the beauty's questions, had already asked for forgiveness on behalf of his master. After all, he had urgent business. However, Turkin could not allow the princess to have her first dinner in Kalinef alone, and so he decided to join her. But narrowing her eyes and blushing, Celeste only quietly reported that she would even be better off alone. And a minute later there was already a huge piece of pie, cheese, and asparagus on her plate. The blonde was clearly surprised by such a huge portion, but Turkin had already told the girl to moderate her admiration. After all, he thought that she was quite hungry and asked her to eat quickly. Taking the cutlery in her hands, Celeste looked at the plate in confusion. After all, banal skills were turning into humiliation. The blonde blushed, and the young man, realizing that she was upset again, was already asking how he could help the girl. Juggling objects in her hands, Celeste smiled stupidly. But she didn't want to lie. That's why she already asked Turkin to help her, and he happily hurried to help. Taking the cutlery in his hands, Turkin was already demonstrating simple skills to the princess. Trying to repeat after him, Celeste already understood that it was far from as easy as it looked. After all, he did it so gracefully that it took her breath away. Approaching the princess, he understood that he had to show the girl how to use the objects in practice. Tarkin took the cutlery in his hands and cut the food served to him with such grace, like an artist applying brushstrokes to a canvas. Celeste couldn't tear her eyes away. She just stared at this simple action, fascinated. After all, it seemed like real art. Pressing himself against the princess from behind and holding her hands, he tried to pass on his knowledge. But from such a touch, the princess completely stopped breathing. However, the man, not noticing her condition, continued to teach the princess. Encouraging the girl, he said that she would very soon do everything better than he did. It was obvious that Tarkin was perplexed. After all, he did not understand at all how the princess had never used a knife and fork. However, Celeste quickly explained that she had only used a spoon. The girl rarely ate meat, and now the brunette understood only one thing. She was fed from the servant's table. A single tear rolled down her face. After all, the blonde couldn't even remember if she had ever eaten fruit in her life. The emotions that overwhelmed Tarkin were indescribable. He did not understand how it was possible to mock a member of the imperial family, and a girl at that. Without mincing words, he already called things by their proper names. After all, Celeste's brother really was a rare bastard. Hearing such words from Tarkin, the princess shuddered. After all, for a moment she thought that she had thought about him like that more than once. Turning around, Celeste saw the young man's face darken. It seemed as if he was ready to burst with anger. However, noticing the girl's gaze, the emperor's servant quickly came to his senses. But he continued to pretend that he did not understand why the princess was looking at him like that, and he was already in a hurry to ask her about it. However, the blonde answered that she was just thinking. Changing the topic of conversation, he thought that he had spoiled her mood. However, the princess was already laughing. After all, she had never heard anyone scold the count. While stabbing pieces of fruit, Celeste listened as Tarkin talked about how if you insult someone, you yourself will eventually be insulted. In high spirits, the princess suggested that the young man begin his meal quickly. After all, everything smelled so fragrant. Watching the beauty, he saw how she tried to quickly use cutlery, but her little hands were shaking. He didn't want Celeste to get nervous and therefore offered to go out while she ate. However, the beauty asked to stay and not leave. Having bowed to the princess, he said that he had to go, and only his reddened skin said that everything was not so simple. Realizing that she didn't dare detain him, the girl was already letting him go. After all, her brain was now thinking only about food, and he didn't care at all. As Celeste watched the man leave, she thought that for a man who had just insulted another, the wizard had excellent manners. However, the cutlery, or rather its presence, did not give the princess any peace. but driven by hunger, she understood that now they had no place in her life. Throwing them aside, she grabbed a piece of pie with her hands. Tearing it into pieces, the girl enjoyed herself, promising to return to etiquette when she was full. Like a savage, she greedily devoured food, forgetting about everything in the world. After all, the animal instinct, drowning out reason, displaced shame and dignity, trying to survive. But suddenly the girl stopped. Bitter tears flowed down her beautiful and at the same time dirty face. It was so delicious, as if she had never seen food before. As Celeste continued to eat her dinner, she was already remembering her mother. I wonder if she had tried such food in Calyx or not, the princess thought. After a while, tea was served, and Turkin joined the girl again, which made her incredibly happy. Looking at the beauty, he said that she shouldn't talk to all her subordinates the way she did to Terega. But looking angrily at the young man, the princess did not understand how she should behave. And she also felt sick, because she had never eaten so much. However, Turkin was in a hurry to teach her etiquette as soon as possible. And now he was talking about how she was forbidden to communicate closely with her subordinates. The princess was only supposed to give short and serious orders, and always walk with her head up. Celeste didn't think it could be that complicated. Having only said that she would try, the girl was already running out of the room. Not understanding what was happening, the emperor's servant rose from his chair. The princess turned green. Nausea, creeping up from within, rose in a heavy wave to her throat. The princess was rushing around the room, and the confused wizard did not take his eyes off her. Running into it, she leaned over the sink. The beauty was throwing up, and the food was to blame, or rather the amount of it. My head was spinning, making it impossible to leave the restroom. Not understanding what was happening, Turkin was already opening the door to the toilet room. But Celeste, turning around abruptly, asked the young man not to enter. After all, she felt so bad that she was afraid of losing consciousness. However, the next moment she was already sliding down the wall, and the frightened Turkin, rushing to help, was already catching the girl. His hands, warm and strong, held the drooping body tightly. Looking at the girl, he did not understand what to do. But the next moment, opening her eyes, she was already languidly addressing him. But the young man, reading the spell, was already trying to help the princess. Looking at him, Celeste could not make out the words, because she did not speak such a language. Warm, sunny rays, breaking through the huge windows, looked with curiosity at the beautiful guest, and she, opening her eyes, did not quite understand where she was. But soon the events of the evening were already completely waking her up. Lying in her huge bed with her hair scattered across the pillow, Celeste tried to remember the details of the evening. But so far all she could remember was that she had fainted. Sitting up in bed, the princess realized that it was morning, and that meant that the blonde had been lying in bed all day. Without thinking, she quickly rang the bell. Cutting through the silence, it hurried to call the servants. The girl who entered bowed. She was ready to fulfill any wish of the princess. However, Celeste asked only for water. But suddenly she asked whether Mr. Batizo had breakfast. However, the servants reminded that the emperor had breakfast early. Moreover, he had already left long ago. The princess lowered her head and sighed, because she dreamed of having breakfast together. But the maid was already interested in what the beauty would like for breakfast. Remembering the evening, she only asked for some light snack, promising that as soon as breakfast was ready, she would immediately bring it to the bedroom. The girl left, and a few minutes later she was already bringing into the room a tray with soup, a fragrant omelet, poured with sauce and garnished with a basil leaf, as well as bread. Holding the cutlery in her hand, Celeste was in indescribable delight. But she was already in a hurry to ask what would happen to the food if the girl didn't finish eating something. Pouring aromatic tea, the maid calmly replied that what was left after the master's meals, they would eat themselves. Thinking quickly, the princess was already saying that the girl could take everything except the bread and soup. After all, she didn't want last night to repeat itself. However, the maid reminded that this was not allowed. After all, in this case, the kitchen would be reprimanded for the tasteless food. But the beauty, really feeling unwell, asked to think of something. However, soon tea was served. Looking at the beautiful brown surface of the drink, the princess for some reason remembered the tea party in Colleen's. And Turkin, who had joined, was already interested in how much better the princess was feeling. She had almost recovered, and she thanked him for his concern. Enjoying the drink, Celeste realized that it was the same tea that Raf had once offered them. However, the taste was completely different, the girl said. The emperor's servant agreed with the princess. It's just that the taste and smell of the drink always depended on who made it. And taking hold of the elegant teapot, He already offered to make it for the princess. Turkin boasted that in Kalinef they make this tea better than at Mr. Raff's. It was an honor for her to have such a great wizard make tea for her. And now he noted that the Khalids knew everything and even more about this drink. Celeste had already noticed that he looked very gallant today, and the luxurious pendant tie perfectly matched his blue waistcoat. But suddenly, raising her finger, the princess said that she knew about these people. After all, they inherited the blood of the fairies when their state was destroyed 100 years ago. Turkin was surprised because he did not expect such knowledge from the princess, and he also praised the girl for her excellent memory. But the next moment, she opened her eyes wide and was already asking the young man if the blood of the Khalids really flowed in his veins. The brunette liked her sly remark. After all, in this way the beauty practically declared that the Khalid was subordinate to the emperor. However, everything was a little different. After all, 5 years ago, Turkin began, he saved Mr. Batizo when he was at war. The princess was surprised, and the brunette, admiring his reflection on the surface of the tea, already admitted that he had come for a reason. Looking sideways at the young man, the princess asked him to quickly tell her what was going on, realizing that it concerned her. The young man didn't want to hide anything. He said that the aristocracy had risen against the wedding of Celeste and Mr. Batizo. Celeste froze. Her plans for a wonderful future were collapsing like a house of cards. She already understood that she would have to forget about marriage for an indefinite period of time. The princess lowered her eyes and blushed. Of course, she assumed that her origin could play a significant role in this story. However, Turkin was quick to say that everything takes time, and she only quietly replied that everything was fine, understood them, and did not even think of putting forward any conditions. But the next minute she was already remembering how the nobles of Calix were constantly gossiping about how Raff could not strengthen his position because of his sister. However, Celeste wanted to believe that everything would be different in Caliph. But apparently she would still have to fight for her place in the sun, the princess thought. Noticing how the girl tensed up, Tarkin was already worried about her condition. After all, the blonde suddenly fell silent, and she, tightly clutching the cup, did not understand at all what to answer. After all, everyone had long known that she was not a princess, but a fake. However, Turkin asked the girl to calm down. He understood that the wedding dates would change, but his master always kept his word. Celeste became sad. Realizing the hopelessness, she thought only that she had no choice but to accept it. But an unexpectedly enlightening thought was already adding a sparkle to her eyes. Something inside the beauty clicked, forcing her to ask a question, and now she wanted to discuss the moment when she fainted. After all, the princess tried in vain to remember what Turkin had said to her then, and the young man, feeling a stream of heat spreading through his ears, suddenly sighed heavily. He didn't want to return to these memories. After all, they, by exposing his feelings, made him feel like the same person as everyone around him. After all, it seemed to him then that the girl who was in his arms was already dead. But suddenly, opening her eyes, she was already addressing him by name. The brunette understood that he had to do something. Reading the spells, he called upon the higher powers to breathe life into the princess. After all, he understood that he could not so easily part with the one who did not leave his head. But continuing to drink tea as if nothing had happened, he only said that he had simply called her. However, Celeste thought differently, and the evening that had descended, illuminating the castle towers, called upon the heavenly bodies to line up for a night parade. She waited for this meeting for 2 long days, and even the huge table that separated them did not prevent the girl from admiring the emperor. It was noticeable that she was now more confident with cutlery, and Celeste's dress only indicated that her future husband had excellent taste. Looking at the emperor, she felt a certain awkwardness, because she knew absolutely nothing about this man. The princess knew that he should start the conversation first, but suddenly a short word was already flying across the huge table. Trying to understand what he was asking about, the princess turned into an ear, pouring wine into a glass and glancing sideways at the blonde. Batiso was already in a hurry to remind her that the girl had promised to learn everything quickly. It seemed like a casual question, but suddenly the man wondered how capable a student the princess could be. Assessing the aroma of the wine, he did not hide that the aristocratic part of society was against her, and they set conditions. The nobility believed, Batizo continued, that the future empress should receive an education worthy of her position. The blonde was surprised. After all, she believed that no one could tell the emperor what to do. However, as she continued eating, She was already thinking about what question to ask the man. Raising her head, the princess was already asking about what education should include. It was history, geography, economics, and etiquette, Batiso specified. But there was something else that Batiso still couldn't bring himself to say. Looking at the beauty, he was still thinking whether to talk about it or not. However, closing his eyes, he decided that Celeste was clearly not yet ready to discuss such a delicate but important topic. Trying to catch every word, Celeste fell silent. However, the girl, completely unaware of what he was hinting at, believed that this was not the most important thing on the list. The blonde was ready to start training immediately. After all, if the wedding day depended on it, the girl was ready to keep her promise. And the emperor confirmed that from tomorrow onwards, teachers in various disciplines would come to her. Having thanked the man, the princess thought about it. After all, she had to go a long way into the world of knowledge, and now the beauty was a little scared. Batiso, continuing to enjoy the aroma of the wine, seemed to have forgotten about her existence for a while. The silence that hung there was oppressive, and only the candles crackled merrily in the candelabra. As she continued to enjoy her food, the princess thought that she had not felt so awkward with Turkin. But after a while, carefully placing the glass on the table, the man noted that she had not eaten anything, and the princess, quickly looking at Batiso, already said that he was quite attentive. But in the evening she overate a little, so she decided to be more careful with food. The blonde, continuing to enjoy the wine, already asked her not to pay attention to etiquette, and already asked the beauty about her wishes, which he could fulfill. But the princess only wanted to look around the castle, and now, a little shyly, she asked his permission to do so. Not understanding how she could ask for obvious things, Batiso was perplexed. However, he only replied that it was enough to ask Tarkin about such things. Continuing to deftly wield cutlery, she already noted that she was finally in the mood. It seemed that the blushing Celeste was ready to burst with happiness. The beauty thanked the emperor for such an interesting time. And now the man was puzzled as to how such little things could completely change the expression on her face. And she, remembering Tarkin's lessons about the need to keep her lips pursed, was already awkwardly covering them with her palms. Rising from the table, the emperor said goodbye. Speaking about the huge amount of work he had to do, Batiso promised to appear as soon as time allowed. Finishing the conversation, he hoped that the girl would focus on studying with Turkin. After all, he was eager to see results in the near future. The princess sighed, looking at the man's back as he left. But in reality, the girl felt that he was completely indifferent to her. She saw that Batiso was a smart and strong emperor. He obviously did not want to go through life with a stupid wife, but a beautiful wife. But one thing was clear, Batiso demanded, and the girl fulfilled all his wishes. At least it was much more pleasant than living in a dismal hovel and enduring beatings. Looking at the emperor's empty chair, she noted that he was so dry that he did not even wish his future wife good night. However, Celeste's next day was already beginning in the library. Surrounded by Turkana's care, she looked with surprise at the neat rows of books in golden covers. Taking out some of them, he was already talking about how her world would soon be turned upside down. "Does he really understand all the subjects?" the beauty asked. However, the smiling wizard, without hiding his pride, already said that there were few teachers in the empire who could surpass him. And the princess didn't even doubt it. She just blushed, realizing how persistent he would be as a teacher. With his hands behind his back, he was already talking about how the training would last exactly 1 year. And he would not be the only teacher. But a loud knock on the door, and the cheerful voice of a young woman who apologized for being late, interrupted the wizard's measured speech. It seemed that the sun, the forest, the flowers, and the birds had simultaneously made their way into the secluded place of the castle, and the red-haired creature was already complaining about the circumstances that had detained her. The revived princess was already answering the brunette that everything was fine, noting that it was the first time she had seen a girl with short hair from an aristocratic family, and Turkin was already introducing Miss Elizabeth Guido from the Count's Guido family. Curtsying, she lowered her eyes and apologized to the princess again. However, Celeste had already said that she was also pleased to meet him. She also asked if the matter that had delayed the girl had been resolved. But the next moment she noticed the condemning glances of her opponents. The princess understood that perhaps she had asked about it too directly, the girl thought. Elizabeth replied that perhaps everything would be decided soon, and the princess was already complimenting her hair. The pleased girl replied that now her hairstyle would become fashionable. Celeste couldn't calm down. It was obvious that the beauty's appearance had aroused genuine interest in her. Turkin already understood that he had fallen into a whirlwind of female emotions, and Elizabeth again thanked the princess for recognizing her free style. Celeste felt that she was already a little envious of the brunette. After all, she had freedom that the princess never had. However, the irritated Turkin asked the guest to calm down and sit down. While Celeste could not get rid of the thought that she could make friends with one of the aristocrats, realizing that she had to calm those present, she was already turning to Elizabeth. After all, Celeste was interested in what subject such a lady with character taught, but the next moment Turkin was already talking about Elizabeth's mission being completely different. After all, she would be the princess's personal servant. It seemed that the blonde was a little shocked, but the next moment she was already saying that she was happy with this choice, and Elizabeth was already rushing for tea. Celeste already understood that many issues were discussed over this wonderful drink, and now she asked the brunette how friendly the girl was with Turkin. Holding the cup, the maid was already saying that she considered him unlucky, and the princess thought that the girl was friendly with him. But suddenly, thinking, the beautiful brunette was already talking about the fact that in a world where everyone lies, perhaps Turkin can be trusted. Indeed, since her visits to Kalinef, the young man had become closer to her than anyone else, Celeste noted. Looking at the cheerful Miss Elizabeth, the blonde already understood that now she would not be bored. Without knowing why, the princess wanted to understand how much she could trust Turkin. After all, she knew absolutely nothing about him, except that he was from the Khalids and owned magic.
In response to the princess's question, Elizabeth quickly spoke about how the secretary had an amazing ability to speak directly to everyone, regardless of their status. Perhaps that's why he never had any luck, the girl added, and Celeste was already laughing as she recalled the young man's blunders. However, this was also the wizard's strong point, the brunette believed, because the girls of Kalinef simply threw themselves at the young man's neck. Raising her finger, she asserted that the guy was handsome, and the lack of status did not prevent him from being on the same level with aristocrats because he was rich. And now Celeste heard that, along with His Majesty, he was one of the main topics of discussion in secular circles. But for a moment, having stopped drinking tea, the beauty was already asking the storyteller about what her future husband, Mr. Batiso, was like. However, the brunette's eyes dimmed, and at first she didn't know what to say. However, then she dryly noted that compared to how he looked and what they said about him, he was much scarier. The blonde flinched and opened her eyes wide, completely confused about what Elizabeth meant. However, the brunette, having quickly come to her senses, was already telling the surprised Celeste that she herself would soon find out everything. After all, she would soon take the place that many were hunting for. The princess closed her eyes and sighed. At that moment, she did not understand whether she could trust the brunette, but everything looked so plausible that it seemed that she was not lying. But the story about her future husband did not leave the beauty's head for a long time. She did not know how scary he was, but she knew for sure that he was unusual. And now the girl is increasingly talking about Mr. Batiso. After all, having agreed to such an adventure, she did not understand what kind of net she had fallen into. However, the next morning, her constant friend and teacher Turkin was already telling her about the winged race. It was interesting, especially since Celeste had promised to be diligent. Passing by the girl sitting at the table, the secretary spoke about the fact that, in Kalinef and Calix, there is a special kind of people who have wings. And before, everyone had such features, the brown-haired man resembled. But because of marriages with foreigners, people with wings remained only in imperial families, and the princess was already surprised by the fact that the wings could be opened and closed at will. However, their color and the color of the individual's hair had to match. Thinking about Rafa at that moment, she remembered his snow-white hair, but whether he had wings or not remained a mystery to Celeste. However, making his way through the princess's thoughts, the young man was already saying that this did not mean that even in the imperial family, wings appear at birth. And showing pictures of children, he reported that until they were 12 years old, there were only traces of them on their backs. However, over time, the wings began to grow rapidly, the men added, and it was already difficult not to notice. Having delved into the past, the princess already recalled the moments when she grew up with her brother, and now childhood was simply intruding into her real life. Squinting her eyes, the beauty thought about how many significant events had happened in those days. After all, when she was just a girl and lived in the imperial court of Calyx, everyone showed interest in her, especially her brother, who was the direct heir of the emperor. Constantly wondering if his sister was of the same blood as him, he checked to see if wings were growing on the girl's back. But there was no sign that the princess would have them. And now, looking down, Celeste understood why he treated her like that. After all, she was not a real princess. And he continued to doubt their blood ties. And Turkane, noticing that the blonde was distracted, was already asking her whether he should continue or not. But the girl, folding her hands, was now thinking about why her mother needed to follow her father, the emperor. However, she did not see any contradictions, because the woman chose such a life for her sake, knowing for sure that imperial blood flowed in her daughter. And now, completely out of the lesson, she did not understand then why she did not have golden wings like her hair. And the young man already saw that something was happening to the princess, but already breaking out of the depths of her thoughts, she answered that everything was fine with her, and also asked if there was anything that he couldn't do. However, Turkan only calmly noted that there was too much in the world that he couldn't do. He also emphasized that he had many shortcomings, but the princess was so inspired by the wings and the imperial blood that she seemed no longer to hear him. However, the secretary, leaning against the table, was already asking that the beauty not hate him when she sees all the guy's shortcomings. The young man's answer surprised Celeste because she had never seen any of them before. And now she thought about how inattentive she was. And now she quietly asked him about what she should hate him for. But the guy only said that sometimes it could be such that she would simply hate him. Hurrying to end the unpleasant conversation, and smiling tenderly, the princess already said that no matter what, she would still like him. After all, the beauty did not understand how she could hate the man who literally changed her terrible life. And now, looking tenderly at the confused wizard, she was already thinking that she would definitely thank the young man for such a gift. But suddenly, having raised herself, she was already talking about wanting to go out and get some fresh air. But the girl promised to return very quickly. However, the young man had already stopped her, asking her to stay for a minute. Taking the red cape off the hanger, he was already making sure that she didn't catch a cold. Throwing it over the princess's shoulders, the brown-haired man already saw her beautiful eyes. The secretary froze for a second, unable to tear his gaze away. And Celeste, as always admiring his care, was grateful to him. But he somehow very quietly answered that he had been doing this for a long time. But she joked and claimed that he cared about her too much. And the guy was already in a hurry to say that caring about her brought him pleasure. At that time, Mr. Batiso, who was passing by the glass door, already saw their sweet conversation. It was impossible to say that he liked it. But without entering the room, the blonde was already passing by. And the night, scattering stars across the dark velvet of the sky, tried to match the grandeur of the beautiful castle, shrouded in silence and magical radiance. In his capacity as Turkan, he hurried to place a letter from the Kronek Empire on Mr. Batiso's desk. The blonde had long since gotten tired of such messages, and the princess who sent them had no self-esteem, since he had refused her many times. But the secretary thought that it would all be over soon, and the blonde thought that while he was single, the girl would think that she still had a chance. However, Turkan hoped that the upcoming ball, at which the princess was to be presented, would put a bold end to this story. However, Batiso, slowly savoring the wine, was no longer listening to Turkan. After all, his thoughts were occupied by only one question. Will the princess from Kronak appear at the ball or not? He seemed to have little interest in anything lately. He was drinking more and more often, and his gaze was becoming dull. But the wizard, watching him, said that it was time to stop this pernicious habit. However, the blonde, putting the glass on the table, quietly complained about the insomnia that had been wearing him out for more than one night. And the secretary, trying to calm him down, claimed that with the receipt of Calyx, they would be able to unite the entire Western continent, and Celeste would help them with this. However, Batiso was not sure whether the girl would cope with the role assigned to her. But Turkan was unhappy that he doubted. After all, the emperor had to trust him. Covering his eyes with his hands, the blonde sighed and admitted that he believed him. But returning to his insomnia, He complained that even medications were no longer helping. The very next moment, he asked the young man for a favor. But the manager restrainedly reminded him that even with magic, one should not rely too much on tea. By bringing his hand to the cup, he filled it with the energy of sleep, helping his master to relax and fall asleep. But suddenly, out of the corner of his ear, the brown-haired man already heard Mr. Batiso asking him whether the wizard went to the temple to pray. Handing the cup over to the blonde, he answered reservedly that the priests were praying for him. Not understanding what the young man was so busy with, the emperor nevertheless advised him to do it personally. He believed that Turkan's magical prayer for him and his late father was especially effective. That's why the blonde asked the boy not to be lazy. Raising his tired gaze, Mr. Batiso could hardly contain his emotions. Lately, he had been tormented by the same terrible dream. In it, his father, who had gone mad, would invariably come to him with a whip and beat him until he bled. It seemed to the man that even in his sleep he felt his presence, and therefore was afraid to close his eyes even for a moment. The wounds and blood never left his memories, and his mutilated back, covered with scars, reminded him of the pain he had experienced in his youth. Looking at the young man, the emperor already reminded him that he and his future wife were disfigured by their relatives. Turning to the manager, he tried to get advice on how they should live with this further. After all, they would have to live with crippled wings. And with his head down, the emperor was already remembering how he first saw the exhausted and dirty princess in the depths of the forest, and the sight of how, upon entering her house, he found Celeste sitting on the cold floor with bloodstains showing through her thin blouse, did not give him any peace. But despite everything, the studies in the Blue Mansion progressed successfully, opening the curtain of knowledge before Celeste, and the teacher noted that the girl was talented. The young lady in the checkered dress reminded her that the program was quite intense. However, she was struck by the seriousness with which the girl approached her studies, and the princess only thanked the woman, and smilingly recalled how difficult it was to study at first. But now her confidence in her abilities grew with each passing day. But for Celeste, meetings with Elizabeth were especially pleasant. After all, over a cup of aromatic tea, all worries seemed to melt away, giving way to carefree laughter and warm conversations. And in the evenings, putting on her best dress, she went to dinner with anticipation, where Turkan patiently taught her etiquette and the rules of behavior of a real lady. Bringing a piece of pumpkin to her mouth, she quietly thanked him. After all, the evenings brought not only knowledge, but also the care that she felt from the young man. Watching the princess, the wizard calmly said that he wanted Celeste not to feel lonely, and the princess understood that the dinner together was the end of her studies during the day. She felt Turkan becoming more than just a teacher for her, and I also saw how he lowered his eyes in embarrassment. The young man was pleased with his student and himself. After all, the girl already handled cutlery easily and gracefully, and could conduct small talk. But now he was asking whether she perhaps needed something else, and Celeste was so happy and contented that she didn't know how to tell him that the issue of money had been bothering her recently. She gathered her courage and admitted that, as a child, living in Calyx, she had not allowed herself to dream. Now, perhaps, she would like something new. Turkan gently insisted that the girl speak about it. He wanted the princess not to feel embarrassed about anything, because she was really allowed a lot. And then Celeste, lowering her voice a little, admitted that she would like to leave the palace and buy a small gift. However, for this, she needed money. Smiling broadly and warmly, Turkan realized that the princess had desires, and this meant that she was beginning to live a real life. He gently reminded that all people need money, and the beauty is no worse than others. Moreover, a personal budget had already been provided for her. The blonde relaxed, lighting up the room with a happy smile, and Turkan apologized for not telling her this earlier. It seemed to him that he had never seen her so bright and alive, but he hastened to add that she would only be able to go out accompanied by security. Celeste had been looking forward to her first walk through Calais, and now everything she saw from the carriage window seemed magical to her. She asked excitedly about the shops and the people bustling about outside the windows, as if afraid to miss the slightest detail. This bright and noisy world seemed like another dimension to her. After all, She knew nothing else except the forest and the wretched house on its edge. But the horses had already stopped at one of the most luxurious shops in Kolonef. Turkan offered to come in. Trusting his words, the princess understood that this jewelry store had the best selection of jewelry. Celeste, not hiding her delight, wanted to take a good look at everything, because she had never been in such a place before. And the pleasant baritone was already luring them into the luxurious salon of wealth and luxury. The shop owner greeted Turkan happily. But when he was introduced to Celeste, he was already happy to serve the future empress. Proudly displaying the best pieces, the jeweler was already highlighting one piece of jewelry in a burgundy box. And the diamond ring from Karsa was truly luxurious and shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow when daylight fell on it. It was obvious that the owner was not lying, because it was a stone of rare beauty, and Celeste, as if dissolved in it, could not take her admiring gaze away. But having heard the location of the diamond's extraction, she already looked warily at Turkan. But he didn't seem to attach any importance to this, because the young man's face remained unperturbed. Gently touching the case, she seemed not to believe that she could buy such luxury. However, the seller continued to enthusiastically talk about and show emeralds and diamonds, causing Celeste to admire them. But the girl said with quiet trepidation that she would like such a hairpin and perhaps a luxurious necklace to go with it. Turkan frowned slightly, not quite understanding her choice, but the store owner was already rushing to pack the order. But suddenly the princess blushed. And will the one for whom she chose it like this gift? Smiling encouragingly, he assured that the girl's choice was excellent. If her heart told her so, then she was not mistaken, the manager added. Sighing with relief and looking down, the princess felt a quiet joy. She had made her choice, but she wanted to look more. Lost among the display cases and knowing nothing about the stones, but falling more and more in love with the sparkling splendor. Looking at the parure of rubies, the princess naively believed that this salon contained all the most beautiful things in the world. But suddenly, her gaze was drawn to a child who was throwing a tantrum outside the window. And Celeste saw how the nanny was already trying to calm him down. But it was all in vain, because the baby was calling for his mother with desperate hopelessness. Celeste cringed. Tears, like memories, covered her. After all, they were already returning to the time when the girl was loved. Mom was her world. They may have lived modestly, but there was enough love in that house for a whole kingdom. She remembered that terrible day when the woman died before her eyes. And the girl, kneeling and holding her mother's hand, did not understand why she did not open her eyes. But breaking out of the past, she already saw a small decoration with a red stone, and the princess, by a strange coincidence, was drawn to it. There was something painfully familiar about the simple ruby ring, framed by tiny diamonds. She hurried to call Turkan to ask how much it cost. However, he replied, smiling softly, that everything in this store costs a lot. But the owner, catching the intonation of the princess's voice, immediately broke into a smile. After all, he was already ready to make a discount for the sake of the princess. However, it seemed that Celeste no longer heard the man's words, trying to remember where she had seen a similar ring. And memory, betraying memories, did not allow one to understand why this decoration was so striking to the beauty. But the next moment, moving away from the display case, she quietly said that there was no need to buy it now. And Turkan already caught her confusion. And the next moment, choosing a modest set from a scattering of diamonds, Celeste was already thinking about the most precious person to her in this world. Returning to the mansion, the princess was already in a hurry to invite Terega to her chambers. Holding out a box neatly tied with a ribbon, she handed the servant a gift. The woman was surprised, thinking that she did not deserve such generosity. But the princess insisted, because she had read that she deserved more. And now the blonde was talking about how she owed her life to the servant. After all, she remembered how she had taken care of her in the past. Despite the fact that the woman was poor, she shared her last piece of bread with the girl and treated her brother after he was tortured, reminded Celeste, helping the girl cope with difficulties and not paying attention to the disapproval of others. She served her faithfully, considering her exclusively a princess. Without holding back her emotions, Terega was already throwing herself on the beauty's neck. After all, she had never heard such words addressed to her. Not knowing how to react, Celeste stopped breathing, and she, crying on her shoulder, remembered how small the princess was and how quickly she grew up. She didn't know how to respond to the woman's warm embrace, but she felt a familiar sense of calm and care. But suddenly, Terega pulled away and hurried to apologize, realizing that she had gone overboard with her emotions. And the very next moment, she reminded him of the dinner, for which Mr. Batiso was expecting the future empress today. Biting her finger, Celeste thought about it. After all, she had absolutely no idea what dress to wear. But hearing the princess's question, Terega already answered that she could stay in this, because it was clean and quite decent. However, it seemed that the idea of changing clothes had caught the girl's attention, and she, surprised by her own desire, understood that changes were happening in her. Tapping her finger on the table, Celeste was nervous, and not so much because of the upcoming meeting with the emperor, but because she always felt tension in his presence. Sitting at the huge table, by candlelight, she thought that she had come too early, and the anxiety that had not left Celeste today did not give her any peace. Suddenly, the door swung open, and she saw Mr. Batiso quickly enter the room. She jumped up and curtsied, saying that she was glad to see the great leader Kalinef. He looked down and asked her not to address him so formally again, noting that such words only increased his melancholy. Smiling, she promised to take this into account, inwardly glad that he was striving for a closer relationship. The dishes served looked delicious, and the dessert exceeded all expectations. Looking into his glass of wine, Batiso was already saying that he had heard about her leaving the castle today, and Celeste, without denying it, explained that she wanted to buy something and did it with great pleasure. He noted that she could invite merchants directly to the palace if she felt tired after studying. Smiling, the man added that if she ever ran short of the allocated funds, the girl should immediately tell Turkin about it. And Celeste, not expecting such care, looked at the emperor with excitement. Previously, she had thought that he was not the type of person who would show concern. She also noted that he was not in the best mood. But the next moment, calling the butler, the emperor already asked to give Celeste a gift. Looking with interest at the approaching servant, the princess already saw a small blue box in his hands, and soon it was already standing in front of her. The princess was not stupid and guessed that it was a decoration, and Batiso insisted that she open the box. The beauty became agitated, unable to hide her emotions. Opening the lid, she held her breath. After all, it was the first time in her life that the girl had received such a gift. But what Celeste saw already made her heart beat faster. After all, inside lay the very same ring with a ruby that the girl had noticed in the salon and which she had told Turkin about. Looking at the beauty's reaction, Mr. Batiso wondered if the princess would like the gift. But all the emotions were already written on Celeste's face. She looked touching and excited. However, the next moment, the princess clarified how expensive the gift was, and the only answer she heard was a light laugh. After all, the emperor was rich enough not to worry about such a purchase. Laughing louder, he added that his condition allowed him to give such gifts. And the girl already felt awkward, because she allowed doubts to be cast on the emperor's capabilities. However, Batiso already calmly said that he was glad about it, because the princess liked the gift. But Celeste no longer heard the man, but only examined the ring with childish admiration. And the emperor saw how the girl blushed. However, later, propping his cheek with his hand, Mr. Batiso noted that he gave the ring only because Turkan mentioned it. Having put the tea on the table, and without looking up, the manager asked whether the princess liked the ring, and Batiso didn't even doubt it. After all, Celeste's blush and embarrassment spoke for themselves. And now, he thoughtfully asked the secretary whether the girl would develop feelings for him after such a gift. However, Turkin replied that everything was possible, and quickly added that this was the way to strengthen relations. Lost in thought, Batiso complained that he didn't like it when something irritated him, and the secretary advised the emperor to restrain his emotions. Otherwise, they could disrupt the plan that they were supposed to adhere to. As he raised his cup to his mouth, the emperor thought that he had recently become more concerned about others. But trying to calm down, he reminded himself that Celeste was just a tool to get Calix. Calmly finishing his tea, he was sure that in the end he was choosing himself anyway. After all, caring for others was contrary to his nature, and Turkan, who had the ability to read minds, already knew what was going on in Mr. Batisso's head. And this clearly gave the guy pleasure. After all, he understood how subtly he could influence his master. Leaving the office with a slight smile, he knew that everything planned had already been set in motion. Elizabeth, sitting in the chair, was so overcome with emotion that she could not hold back the squeals that were already filling the room. Celeste sheepishly justified herself and claimed that she had chosen the gift by chance. Although she was being a little disingenuous, as she had thought for a long time about what could please the brunette. And the girl, looking at the hairpin, did not hide her awe and continued to mentally thank the universe for the unexpected gift. The princess blushed slightly and shyly rejoiced. She was pleased that the gift was liked. After all, she knew that she had chosen it for a girl from a noble family. But Elizabeth could not calm her excitement. Her lively temperament pulsated in every movement. In a trembling voice, she promised the princess to take care of him. Watching the stormy reaction of the brunette, Celeste did not know how to behave. She simply smiled, enjoying real emotions. But suddenly, Elizabeth began to rummage through her bag rather animatedly, and her face flushed with new excitement. And after some time, a neat blue case appeared from the depths of the bag. Celeste shuddered. Feeling a slight excitement, the princess did not take her eyes off the box, and could not even understand how it opened, and the brunette literally beamed with happiness. Closing her eyes, she begged the princess to open the gift quickly. On the velvet pillow lay a lavender hairpin. It seemed as if it had been specially made for the princess, because it set off her beautiful eyes, and the brunette was already in a hurry to pin the hair clip to Celeste's hair. After all, she dreamed of looking at this image. Looking in the mirror, she sighed with admiration, saying that she had no doubt that the gift would be perfect for the blonde. Elizabeth remembered the upcoming event very well. After all, Celeste was to be presented as the future empress there. And with all her heart, she wanted the girl to shine brighter than anyone else. But thoughts about the upcoming event caused the princess an inexplicable anxiety. After all, the blonde understood that she would be closely assessed at the ball. And now, telling the brunette that this was her first social event, Celeste was interested in what Kalineff's social society was like. But according to the brunette, it was arrogant. And lowering her eyes and blushing, Elizabeth was already saying that these parties were only needed for aristocrats to have sex. The princess looked at the brunette with horror. However, the girl, realizing that she had allowed herself to be frivolous, hurried to apologize. And she immediately explained that all the activities at the ball were aimed at finding a lover. However, the princess had already asked the brunette how often she participated in the life of society. After all, finding a lover, Celeste assumed, was an interesting occupation. Continuing to drink tea and dessert, Elizabeth reported that she sometimes went out into society because her parents and older brothers were worried about her fate. But soon, clenching her fists in anger, she simply screamed that true love could not be found in such a place, although she would like to find it. But Celeste was really curious to know where true love could be found. And now, slightly embarrassed, she asked the brunette this question. Sighing heavily and looking down, the girl admitted that she had not yet met such a person. After all, love must come when the right time comes. But the very next second, she confessed that she had met her once. Only it ended very quickly and sadly because the guy cheated on her. And now the princess remembered why the brunette looked so upset at their first meeting. Probably the girl was worried about a broken engagement. Trying to change the subject, Elizabeth was already talking about fate. And she even assumed that Celeste and the emperor were destined for each other. After all, before her, he didn't even want to hear about marriage. The princess thought about it. And the brunette, watching her, quietly noted that if a person changes his decisions so categorically, then perhaps fate itself was trying to intervene. But it seemed that at that moment, Celeste was no longer listening to the girl. After all, she was remembering the dinner and the ring that the emperor had so unexpectedly given her. It was such an unexpected gift that from then on, she found herself thinking about it more and more often. And it was these thoughts that made her heart beat faster. And the next morning, the waltz music that sounded from the great hall of the mansion was already carried to all corners of the park. Turkan, carefully holding the princess by the hands, tried to lead her in a gentle rhythm, softly and smoothly guiding the movements. He quickly counted out loud and reminded her to move her left leg back. He also tried to convince the princess to focus not on the music, but on his prompts. Noticing that the princess's movements were rather constrained, he again asked her to count her steps and relax a little. But, irritated by the girl's failures, the next moment he turned to the musicians and demanded that they stop. And Celeste, starting to get angry and leaning closer to Turkin, admitted that she was trying to follow his instructions, but she still couldn't do anything. However, the wizard reminded that on the day of the ball, the tension would only increase. And if the princess did not learn to control herself, she would become the subject of ridicule. But she tried to object, suggesting to cut the rest of the classes and replace them with dancing. But the secretary was against it, because the girl's legs could swell from the strain. Having calmed down a little, Celeste exhaled. However, she felt that the tension between them was growing stronger. Disheveled and tired, she said that she had put all her efforts into studying science, but her body could not cope with dancing. Turkan continued to insist, encouraging the girl and noting that today she was already moving better than yesterday. However, the next moment he stopped abruptly and reproached her for her bad posture, because leaning back made her position unstable. Reminding him that he had pointed out this mistake from the very beginning, he was clearly angry. And Celeste, closing her eyes, only thought about how close he was pressing himself to her. But the guy had already talked about the girl shortening the distance a little. After all, it seemed to him that the princess was constantly moving away from him. Taking another step forward, Celeste asked in a measured tone if that was enough, and Turkin nodded, suggesting he try again. He asked the princess not to look at her feet, but to simply trust him and the music. When the tempo began to increase, the girl was already complaining that he was too pushy. However, Turkan soon stopped, reminding them how important it was to learn to relax while dancing. But the secretary had his own tricks. Opening his arms, he gently beckoned her closer, as if inviting her to trust him. The manager held out his hands and waited for Celeste to take a step towards him. And the next moment, hugging the beauty, he felt their hearts beating in unison. And she felt like the man had forgotten where the difference was between a lesson and feelings. Having moved away a little, the princess looked into his eyes with bewilderment. She did not understand why such techniques were necessary, and he, continuing to press the princess to himself, already heard how she quietly but persistently asked to let her go, and the guy felt her smell and breath. But the young man was already calmly talking about the girl, laying her head on his shoulder and hugging him with both arms. The blonde was overcome with excitement, but the wizard insisted. After all, this was necessary in order to achieve a result, Turkan added. And after a few minutes, the man demanded that the musicians play again for the couple, who were already picking up the pace. Gradually, their steps began to coincide, and the girl's body adjusted to the rhythm. And the music no longer bothered the beauty. Holding tightly to Turkan, the princess was surprised to realize that she felt completely different. Her movements became more natural, her steps more confident, and she was getting more and more in tune with the beat. She felt grateful for his patience and felt her mood improve. Smiling, Celeste praised the young man again, admitting that he truly was the best teacher in the world. But Turkin seemed to be having difficulty containing his emotions, and his face turned slightly red. Celeste noticed the change, and she didn't understand why he suddenly went silent. After all, approval or criticism should have come from his lips. Looking at the silent secretary, she began to doubt that maybe everything was not as good as it seemed to her. Not wanting to leave everything unanswered, she asked the secretary directly, because she felt that she was doing a better job today. But there was no answer. Not understanding what was happening, the blonde looked at him in surprise, trying to catch the man's emotions. But he continued to silently lead her in the dance, showing no interest and only moving automatically to the music. It didn't last long. Soon he slowed down and stopped, and after a short pause, he suggested finishing the lesson for today. However, Celeste, flushed from the intense movements, did not understand why everything ended so suddenly, because there was still enough time left until the end of the lesson. But the young man, in his apology, referred to an urgent matter that required immediate attention. He walked away quickly, leaving her alone with her thoughts. And the princess, who had only just begun to notice progress in her dancing, looked after the man in confusion. Turkan, however, was quickly heading towards the exit, already clenching his fists. After all, he felt how excitement was rising inside him, which he could not control. But suddenly, he stopped abruptly, covered his face with his hand, and took a deep breath. However, the thoughts in his head continued to get confused. He was frightened by the force with which he was drawn to the princess. After all, her eyes, voice, and scent captivated him. And during the dance, everything only intensified. He realized that he was losing control not only over the situation, but also over his own mind and feelings. And now the young man did not recognize himself. Trying to curb his desires and pull himself together, he felt his mind crumbling into pieces. After all, the young man had never experienced such feelings in his life. Meanwhile, the morning light was already softly streaming into the study room, where the girl spent her daily hours of study, and the mentor in the green dress, slowly explaining the rules of subordination and court behavior, already saw that something was wrong with Celeste. The girl tried to listen, because the conversation was about the ranks of the nobility, their hierarchy, and the correct attitude to etiquette. But her attention seemed to slip away through the window opening. Constantly glancing at it, the beauty saw how girls in magnificent dresses were arriving at the ball along the alley surrounded by flowers, and among them, one beauty stood out in particular. After all, it was impossible to take your eyes off her berry-colored hair and provocative red outfit. The woman hurried to introduce Princess Elodia of the Kingdom of Cronac to Celeste, and the girl, embarrassed, apologized for not being able to concentrate. But the teacher only nodded understandingly, adding that they had already covered all the planned material and could finish the lesson. However, Celeste did not understand why Mr. Batizo had invited Elodie to the ball. After all, it was she who had been sending him letters inviting him to meet. And Terega, watching the arriving guests through the window, stood with a confused face. And her heavy sighs clearly showed that not everything was so good. Turning to the princess, she noted with alarm how many honored guests had already arrived, although there were still 4 days before the ball. Celeste also heard voices coming from the street. It seemed to her that everyone was excited about something, and the girl was curious about what they were talking about. Particularly notable was the loud laughter of the woman, whose exclamations were interrupted time after time by ringing laughter. By asking Terega to open the window, Celeste wanted to hear at least snippets of the conversation. Opening the doors, she let a whole wave of sounds into the room. The princess desperately wanted to understand what everyone was talking about, but the general hum made the speech almost unintelligible. Approaching the window, Celeste tried to pretend that she was just breathing fresh air. But out of the corner of her eye, she saw the maid ask Elodie to be quieter. But the guest in the red dress openly said that she had come here precisely because of Mr. Batizo, and judging by the girl's expression, she liked the castle too. With her arms folded across her chest, and in a great mood, she enthusiastically declared that she could smell the owner of the mansion. And Celeste had already heard that the guest was walking on the same grass that Batizo himself walked on, and this in itself made her happy. But looking out the window, the princess did not see anything reprehensible in the guest's emotions. However, the better the guest's mood became, the worse the blonde's was. After all, Elodia noted that the emperor was not married, but was only planning a wedding. Trying to contain her irritation, Terega was angry at the woman who was talking such nonsense, and Celeste asked her not to bend over, because they could be seen. Lost in thought, the blonde realized what Elodia was talking about. After all, the girl was right that the emperor's wedding was still only in the plans. Moreover, Celeste clearly understood that the people of the country of Kalinefi would be much more willing to support Elodia than her. And the guest seemed to be well aware of this. The princess's position was indeed precarious, and she had to be careful. But a moment later, the princess left the observation post, and the worried maid fearfully asked where she was going. But Celeste only wanted to repeat what she had learned today. Sitting on the sofa, she concentrated on repeating her teacher's lesson, and the maid, watching her, asked her not to overdo it in trying to get closer to the status of a real princess. Continuing to leaf through the book, Celeste had already heard from Terega that all the guests had been invited personally. but she had not seen an invitation for the girl in the red dress. However, the princess no longer heard anything around her, and she did not even look at the pages of the book she held in front of her. After all, her thoughts had carried her to a completely different place. The blonde remembered the last waltz rehearsal before the ball. The counting, the steps, the movements kept ringing in her head. She tried to understand how well she was doing, and often asked the wizard about it. But the guy kept saying that she needed to practice more. Of course, she couldn't compare with the girls who had been trained in dancing since childhood, the princess thought, but this only motivated Celeste. However, when the princess saw the confident Elodia again, her anxiety instantly increased. Turkin noticed that the girl was preoccupied with something, and this upset him. It seemed that she did not hear the words at all, and her gaze was moving away. Stopping, he said that it was enough for today, because her results had really improved. Celeste disagreed. She reminded him that not long ago he himself had criticized her skills and demanded that she work, and now she insisted on continuing. The princess pressed her lips together and frowned. She also asked if he wanted to run away again, like it happened last time. However, the secretary had already said that her progress had impressed the man. And Celeste looked in the manager's eyes with surprise for confirmation of his words. But the smiling wizard noted that no one would dance better than him at the ball anyway. And then he suggested postponing the dancing until the next lesson, giving the princess a chance to rest. However, the beauty was stubborn and even tried to take offense. After all, she noted that she was still not good enough, and Turkin quickly apologized if he seemed impudent to her. But the next moment, playfully looking at the wizard, she had already calmed him down. After all, in fact, his praise meant a lot to the girl. After finishing the lesson, he suggested that she rest a little, and he went out to fetch some water. Handing Celeste a glass, Turkan asked if she had seen Princess Elodia. However, realizing that she should be more careful, she replied that it was purely by accident. However, she hurried to ask Turkan whether the princess from Kronak had been invited to the ball. With a slight smile, the manager claimed that only Mr. Batiso decided which of the nobility to invite. Clutching the glass, the girl did not understand why he invited her, because she constantly sent letters to the emperor and received only refusals in response. And Turkin didn't understand how Celeste had found out about these letters, and there was genuine bewilderment in his voice when he asked about it. But remembering Elodia, he guessed that with her character and long tongue, it was not surprising. After all, rumors were flying around her. Sitting down on the sofa, the confused Celeste assumed that the emperor had other plans for her. But he had promised to introduce her at the ball. But the secretary was upset by her reaction. After all, he understood that the princess could not have romantic feelings for the emperor, but she was worried. And she was already quietly saying that she simply needed to know. And Turkin replied that the emperor had most likely invited Elodia, so that she would retreat from her desires. Remembering the image of an active and persistent girl, the princess already understood that she did not look like the kind of person who would give up easily. But Turkin did not understand how the blonde knew about the girl and when their conversation took place. But the girl assured the wizard that they had not met. And now she said that she had simply seen the princess through the window and heard the conversation. Looking at the princess, Turkan didn't know what to answer, and she already asked him not to tell him that it was none of her business, because she was quite serious. And the next moment, the wizard was already acting. Heading towards the sofa where Celeste was sitting, he said that he had a plan. Having plopped down next to the princess, he was already suggesting that she rein the princess in. The beauty opened not only her eyes, but also her mouth in surprise, unable to utter a word. And he, not understanding what the problem was already saying that why shouldn't the blonde show her character? But the young girl was terribly worried, and her heart was pounding wildly in her chest, foreseeing trouble. Thinking about how Turkan had always been her support, she understood that the matter with the princess could not be trusted to him, because his plan seemed too cunning. Clutching the glass of water tightly, she was already thinking that it was time to become stronger and try to figure this issue out on her own. After all, the guest's energy was quite aggressive, and therefore, we will have to act using her own methods. But most of all, the blonde was afraid that she would start to provoke her, and Celeste would not be able to defend herself. However, after a few minutes, words of admiration and cheerful feminine laughter were already heard in the mansion. After all, the dress that the maids brought in was stunning. Its extraordinary heavenly color was clearly going to cause a furor at the ball. It seemed that the princess, putting her hands to her face, lost the power of speech. After all, she could not even imagine that she would ever be able to have such an outfit. And the maid, having bowed, was already reminding that it had been brought for fitting, and it would only be completely ready for the ball. However, Celeste's gaze was already stopping at the many frills, beautiful pearls, and large flounces. For some reason, at that moment, it seemed to her as if it belonged to someone else. But the next moment, she asked herself not to be too suspicious. And tearing the blonde out of her annoying thoughts, Terega was already loudly calling for the princess to come to the window. It seemed that the day of surprises was never ending. After all, among the guests who arrived at the ball, Celeste already saw a person dear to her. This meeting was so unexpected that she quickly turned to God and thanked him. After all, a pleasant young man was moving through the park, and judging by everything, the princess was glad to see Aranad. It seemed to Celeste that she could think of nothing else. After all, turning around, the girl was hurrying to the exit. The maid asked her to be careful, or better yet, not to meet her friend at all. However, the girl could not be stopped. Holding up her dress and quickly moving her legs, Celeste rushed towards the guy. After all, he was her only friend from Calix, who always supported the princess. The smile never left the beauty's face, and even memories associated with difficult moments in her life did not spoil her mood. After all, Celeste had once been sent to the dungeon for disobedience, and only the flickering flame was a fragile symbol of hope in the silent darkness of the prison. Not expecting to see anyone other than the guards, she asked in surprise if he had really come to see her. And the young man, with an expensive brooch on his tie, smiling through the bars of the cell, said that he wanted to see the girl. Looking down and sighing heavily, she quietly said that it was strange to want to meet a princess who could not help in any way. But the young man insisted that he was not going to ask for anything. He simply wanted to be friends with her, because he felt very lonely in the castle. The princess was surprised. After all, everyone she knew from the imperial family was arrogant and incapable of such actions. But the guy was clearly different from them, and already with interest she asked about his name. But the guy was in no hurry to answer. And it was noticeable how the young man was noticeably nervous, fiddling with his fingers. However, the next time he put his hand to his heart, he introduced himself as Arnaud Liance. And now, running along the red carpet to meet the handsome blonde, the princess rather emotionally shouted out his name. Turning his head and looking at Celeste with his blue eyes, he didn't seem to expect to see her here. The guest blushed in surprise. And Turkin, by a strange coincidence, had already witnessed this meeting. Extending her hand, the princess was ready to embrace the young man, because she felt how much she missed him. Not knowing how to behave, he nevertheless embraced the girl. And she excitedly spoke about how long she had been waiting for this meeting. A few seconds later, moving away from the young man, the princess admitted that she was incredibly happy to see Aranad, and was happy that he had been invited. The young man laughed and asked not to squeeze him so hard. After all, it seemed that the beauty was about to strangle him. His words upset Turkin very much, because now he wanted to be in his place. Bombarding the guest with questions, Celeste was already interested in how the guy got there and whether the road had been difficult. And the wizard noted with slight sadness how caring the girl could be. Having apologized and tried to calm the raging emotions, the princess offered to go inside to talk. But Aranad refused, because it could be not very convenient. Holding his hands, she noted with a smile that he looked good after the journey. But he admitted that he had not spent time on the journey, because he had used spatial movement. She was glad that the man looked healthy. Besides, she knew how magic worked, and nothing surprised her. However, not even a minute had passed before Celeste again wanted to throw herself into Aranad's arms, telling him how much she missed him. But he, already a little nervous, tried to protect himself and the blonde. And so, putting his hands in front of him, he already said that they were not in Calix's dungeon. The princess hurried to thank the young man for his common sense. But after thinking about it, she already suggested having breakfast together tomorrow. And he, not knowing the rules in Kelenef, again asked how possible this was, since, unlike the girl, He had been taught stricter manners. But the guy couldn't refuse the princess and quickly agreed, and also tried to leave this place as quickly as possible. And the blonde was already talking about sending a man for him tomorrow. Now the girl felt like this was the best thing that had happened in a long time. She didn't want to part with the young man, but she still wanted him to have a good rest. And he answered her just as tenderly and cheerfully. And it was obvious that there was a very old and good connection between these people. Celeste felt relieved. After all, she already understood that he was really okay, despite his poor health. And now she remembered that in Calix, they had been in similar conditions, so they often supported each other. But a voice from behind her, clearly addressing her, was already asking how busy she was. The princess turned around to look at the approaching disaster. Holding her breath for a second, she thought about what to answer. After all, standing in front of her was the one Celeste least wanted to meet. But the lady was already looking at the blonde. Quickly pulling herself together, the beauty bowed and said that she was pleased to meet the guest. However, the rival already knew that this was not a real princess, because rumors about the girl had spread far beyond the borders of the Kalanef Empire. And even more than that, she had heard that the pretender to the role of empress was ill-mannered and not at all beautiful. However, everything turned out to be quite the opposite. This angered the guest, who had counted on the state to which she belonged to do everything to ensure that Princess Calixa did not come here. But at some point, everything changed dramatically, and Elodia was already asking the girl if she knew who was standing in front of her. And Celeste claimed that such beauty was impossible not to notice. Without hiding her impudence, the guest reminded that she tried to look beautiful because there was a man for whom the girl was doing all this. Celeste felt she had to endure this fight, but she didn't want to fight her opponent. Smiling slightly, she praised Elodie. After all, her efforts were noticeable. And again, she complimented the princess from Cronach. It is unclear why, but the next moment, Princess Elodia, lowering her eyes, was already politely thanking the girl for this. But when she came to her senses and opened her eyes wide, she no longer understood what she was thanking the fake princess for. Unable to restrain herself, Elodia was already changing the tone of her voice, pretending that nothing was happening, although Celeste noted the changes in the princess's face. However, she was already on the offensive. She embraced herself with her arms and confessed that she loved the emperor. After all, this was the man for whom she wanted to look beautiful. Celeste agreed that Mr. Batiso was a very attractive man, and many people loved him. But she noticed to herself that her rival was too frank. But the next minute, Elodia was already saying that not everyone who loved the emperor had royal blood in their veins, and therefore they should not be compared to her. The blonde frowned. Trying to control herself, she thought through every word. Having collected her thoughts, she only added that she did not consider royal blood to be anything particularly important. Celeste had already seen Elodie's hands tremble, and so she decided to end the conversation by declaring at the end that she knew the truth. Otherwise, the emperor would not have made a choice in her favor. The last words deeply touched the guest, and a second later, the girl was already screaming that maybe it was so now. But very soon, Mr. Batizo would realize everything, and Celeste, already calmly looking at the guest, asked not to insult the emperor. After all, in his person, she was trying to insult the entire empire of Kalanef. Elodia blushed, not expecting at all that some unrecognized princess would allow herself such impudence. She was clearly nervous, but trying to ease the tension, Celeste smiled reservedly and suggested that her guest rest after the long journey. It was obvious that the girl had won the argument, and the princess from Cronach, with her head down, was almost crying. And turning around sharply, Elodia was already heading away, throwing out on the go that she was not going to give up. However, looking after her, Celeste was already thinking that suddenly all the grandeur of the princess had disappeared, and the guest's behavior was reminiscent of the behavior of a child who was offended. But the surprises didn't end there, and the next moment someone threw a cloak over her shoulders. Celeste froze, not understanding who could have done such a thing. However, turning around sharply, she already saw Turkan, and he asked her to return to the mansion, because the wind outside was getting stronger. Moving towards the entrance, Celeste was already asking the guy if he had heard or seen her conversation with the guest. However, He not only heard, but also saw, the secretary admitted. Holding her cloak, the princess quickly said that she expected resistance from Elodia, but she didn't think that everything would happen so spontaneously. However, looking down, Celeste admitted that she was partly envious of her self-confidence. Everything about her appearance spoke of her having grown up in love, with ribbons and frills on her dress. And the very next minute, looking at Turkan, the girl asked to remove all the ribbons and frills from her dress. Having gone up to the room, the princess sat down in a chair, continuing to think about the conversation in the garden. And Terega, who had come up with a tray in her hands, was already asking how Mr. Aranade was doing. Enjoying a cup of tea, the princess was already saying that everything was fine with him, and they agreed to meet tomorrow morning, because there was so much she wanted to ask. But quickly crossing the room, a servant was already approaching Celeste, who had an important message for her mistress. Celeste felt her heart clench. After all, Elodia had invited her to dinner that evening. The blonde, looking absent-mindedly at the servants, did not yet understand whether she was ready for dinner with a rather specific guest, and Terega, who had already reminded that there was very little time left before dinner, could not hide her curiosity about such a rush. As she lifted her cup to her lips, Celeste knew that Princess Elodia had clearly not said everything, but she had no choice but to agree to the meeting. Crystal candelabras with candles softly illuminated the room, giving the evening a festive atmosphere, and the princess from Kronak, who was already sitting at the table, greeted Celeste with a smile and thanked her for the invitation to dinner. But Celeste, recalling that it was the guest who suggested spending the evening together, noted that according to the rules of etiquette, it was the hostess who should have invited. Watching the girl manage the serving of dishes, Elodia corrected her and reminded her that calling herself a hostess before marriage was a premature statement. Moreover, she added that the date of the ceremony had not yet been chosen, and Celeste would become the mistress of Kalinef only after the marriage. However, the blonde abruptly stated that she planned to become empress solely by the decision of Mr. Batiso, and not by her own. Celeste did not understand why the guest was opposing the will of the emperor. After all, only he could decide what to do, but not Princess Elodia. The guest bit her lip and fell silent, but it was noticeable that irritation was beginning to build up inside her. While tasting the wine, Celeste understood that the argument between them would continue. The beauty understood that it would be difficult, but she was mentally preparing for it, and the guest, putting her hand to her chest, already declared that she would become the Empress of Kalinef, and urged the blonde not to doubt it. Moreover, the Princess of Kronak considered that her rival was behaving too impudently. However, Celeste, closing her eyes, was already asking why the guest thought so, since she had not offended her in any way. But the blonde had already heard that the pretender to the throne was still a fake princess of low birth, and it was even unpleasant for Elodie to talk about it. Having placed the glass on the table, the princess listened as the guest asserted that a person without royal blood could not take the place of the empress. Continuing to humiliate her interlocutor, she reminded him that Celeste, having become empress, would harm the country and his majesty. Looking into the girl's eyes, Elodia claimed that this would cause the empire's status to decline, and Kalinef's prestige abroad would be undermined, and the emperor and his wife would not be able to win the people's respect. Tapping her fingertips on the table, Celeste began to realize that she was dealing with a manipulator. She wanted to smooth things over, but she already knew that she had to teach her guest a lesson. Looking across the table at Elodia, she said decisively that a real princess would not allow herself to behave like that. Celeste recalled that the princess had sent letters to the emperor proposing a meeting, and had already asked whether this was not an act of impudence. Moreover, the blonde noted that the letters continued to arrive even after the emperor stopped answering them. However, the girl could no longer be stopped. And although each word was difficult, Celeste explained that the situation for Elodie had changed. After all, the emperor was already engaged. The blonde pointed out that the guest had the audacity to say such impudence to his future wife's face, and such behavior raises doubts about the girl's morality. But the princess from Kronak, covered in red spots, was simply shouting that she had done no harm to either the country or the emperor. However, the princess, looking at the guest with sadness, reminded her that she had not harmed Mr. Batiso either, and all the assumptions about Celeste were just assumptions. But the blonde, skillfully turning the topic of conversation, asked again about the letters that Elodia wrote to the emperor. After all, despite the refusal, she bombarded the man with proposals, which put him in an awkward position, Celeste noted, and she made a laughing stock of her kingdom. And to put a bold point, the princess mentioned that even ordinary people had already spoken about this. Celeste had never thought she could be cruel. But now she noticed that rumors about Elodie's letters were no longer just circulating within Kalinef. But the next moment, the blonde already saw that the guest, realizing the scale of her shame, was ready to cry. Washing down her speech with a glass of wine, Celeste felt disgusting. But she could no longer behave differently. After all, the girl's patience had run out. No longer able to withstand the pressure and leaning on the table, Princess Elodia announced that she was leaving the dinner. Looking at her back, the blonde was already thinking that even though the guest had spoken about her low origins, she still did not want to hurt her. And now the princess realized that the number of enemies around her was growing. And this made Celeste feel uneasy, as if the past was returning to her life again, and there was already a knock at the door. But it seemed that the princess did not hear anything around her. However, the next moment, a familiar voice was already calling her. Celeste flinched. Looking at Turkan, she asked when he had entered, and the surprised man only looked at her strangely. He was looking for the princess, and Terega said that she was having dinner with a guest from Kronak. But looking at Elodie's empty chair, he realized that the dinner was over before it had even begun. However, the next moment, Celeste was already complaining that after meeting the princess, she fully felt the support of the kingdom and the entire aristocracy. After all, if we compare them, then of course the princess from Kronak would be more suitable for the place of the empress. But the secretary understood that she was scared. But the manager asked the girl not to worry, because Mr. Batizo would definitely keep his promise. However, the princess, folding her hands, was already in a hurry to say that his words would not be enough. After all, what is needed is a promise that the princess can present to everyone, like a reliable shield. And the morning of the next day was already in a hurry to replace the shadow of the past with the lightness of the new. After all, filling the room with light and warmth, it brought with it a pleasant meeting in the person of Aranad. She had always dreamed of such a light and pleasant breakfast. Celeste looked fresh and charming, and was happy to show off her successes to her old friend. Speaking about studying various subjects, she saw that the guy was really interested in her story. However, Aranad was already paying attention to the ring on the princess's finger. At some point, it suddenly seemed to her that the young man had stopped listening to her. But unable to take his eyes off the beauty, he was already apologizing, and she was already wondering if the food was so tasteless that the plate in front of Aranad remained almost untouched. However, he answered that he had no appetite in the mornings. She gently scolded the guy and said that if he ate little, he would become weak. But the young man only laughed. He saw how the girl had changed during this time, and he liked these changes, and now he was interested in how much Mr. Batizo cared about her. But the girl quickly answered that he was very kind to her. Holding out her hand for the guest to see, the princess had already drawn his attention to the ring presented by the emperor. And since the story of his acquisition was quite interesting, and the gift was expensive, Celeste was in a hurry to tell it to Aranadu. Slowly scooping up soup with a spoon, the young man suddenly asked how happy the girl was. But the princess didn't know the answer to this question yet. However, Aranad had already hinted that each person has their own level of happiness, and only she can know hers. Looking at the young man, she replied that, compared to her past life, she was living well now, and the princess was already in a hurry to invite her friend to her wedding. But without waiting for an answer, she was already talking about how he should definitely come. Lowering his beautiful green eyes, Aranad replied that he would think about it. But in reality, he understood only one thing, that it would be enough for him if the girl was happy. Looking at the princess, he had no doubt that she would be a magnificent empress, because he knew the real her. With a slight smile on her lips, she expressed genuine joy at the thought that he would be there on her wedding day. However, a knock on the door was already distracting Celeste from the thoughts she was immersed in. Still feeling the warmth of a pleasant meeting, She turned her head. Holding the book under his arm, Turkan calmly reminded them that it was time for classes. And despite the fact that the princess did not want to part with the pleasant moments and Aranad, she nodded obediently. A blush deepened the princess's cheeks, and holding her gaze on her friend, she confessed to the secretary that she would like to talk a little longer. Turkan glanced at the untouched dessert, reminding them that they would see each other again. And Celeste was already gently asking Aranad to take care of himself until the next meeting. Approaching the door, the young man turned around, and without saying a word, he simply waved his hand silently, leaving a light trace of farewell in the air. And Celeste, reciprocating, looked tenderly at her departing friend, while the manager standing next to her looked gloomier than a cloud. When the door closed behind the guest, the room seemed empty. Only now did the girl realize how much he meant to her. The princess quietly exhaled, as if returning to reality, and the secretary was already discreetly noting that Celeste and Aranad had become too close. In high spirits, she tried to keep the echo of the conversation that had just ended. But Turkan was already unexpectedly interested in how much she liked the young man. The princess thought about it, but the next phrase left Celeste stunned. After all, the secretary had said that in Kulinef, the empress was allowed to have a lover. However, such reasoning was unacceptable to Celeste. And now she menacingly declared that Aranad was like an older brother to her, and Turkan should not say such things. The princess really liked the young man, who inspired her confidence. But there was nothing more between them than friendship, the beauty added. However, the wizard stood his ground, and he believed that friendship between a man and a woman that lasted too long often developed into love. Not wanting to continue the conversation, Celeste restrainedly suggested moving on to classes. But Turkan already understood that his mood was spoiled, and it would be better to postpone the lesson. Holding out a handkerchief, he calmly spoke about the girl wiping the blood from her nose. After all, she had looked tired lately, and this worried the guy. Putting his hand on the book, he explained that they were already ahead of schedule, so a day of rest wouldn't hurt. He advised the girl to sit down on the sofa. Celeste could barely contain her irritation. But Turkan believed that in order to endure the upcoming ball and not collapse without strength in front of Elodia, she needed to rest more. And indeed, sitting down on the sofa, the princess exhaled. Lately she was clearly tired, but she stubbornly held on, not allowing herself to relax. Turkan came closer and knelt down in front of her. He clearly understood that the stress that had fallen on Celeste in the last few days was not easy. The sight of the man at her feet embarrassed the beauty, but the manager was already calmly saying that if you add fatigue to anxiety, even simple things may not work out. There was calm in his voice. The man tried to encourage her, saying that she was doing well, and there was nothing to worry about. Celeste's gaze warmed. Despite her fatigue, she sincerely thanked the guy, feeling how his support restored her confidence. And a moment later, the girl was smiling. After all, she understood that there was no one wiser than Turkan in her circle. And in the sky, one after another, fireworks were already flashing, giving the sky bloody shades. And only the high towers of the mansion could make up an ensemble for such a spectacle. The arriving guests filled the halls with a light hum of voices and the rustle of fabrics, and the butlers hurried to offer them drinks. The crowd increasingly spoke of the fake princess, and the rumors spread so quickly that many were convinced that Celeste would benefit their state. However, some, looking at Mr. Batiso with bewilderment, did not yet understand what exactly made him choose the princess from Calix, and he, closing his eyes and enjoying the aroma of wine, was already thinking about how verbose aristocrats can be at such receptions. But the next moment, the door opened, and the butler announced the exit of Princess Celeste, representative of the Empire of Calix. It was a truly exciting moment for the blonde. She felt like she was about to pass out from tension and fear. However, the guests could already see the beautiful girl in the azure dress, and her light hair, decorated with a hairpin, only emphasized her delightful image. But only one of the men in the hall shuddered in confusion at the sight of Celeste. After all, he decided that there was someone else in front of him, and words of surprise were already spreading through the crowd. After all, the public did not expect to see such beauty. Meanwhile, Celeste was struggling to contain her trembling. She clutched the hem of her dress with her fingers, trying to convince herself not to worry. She recalled Turkin's words about smiling and being more confident, and the princess already slightly raised the corners of her lips, trying to match the image. Mr. Batiso was truly pleased with the blonde's appearance, although he did not show it too clearly. The man extended his hand towards the girl, and for a moment, he held his gaze on her. After all, everything about her appearance seemed new to the emperor, and he tried to examine it. And Celeste, casting a quick glance at Mr. Batiso, realized with relief that everything had turned out exactly as she had dreamed. The princess exhaled and relaxed slightly, and the emperor had already seen that she was wearing his gift. After all, a ring with a ruby was glittering on her finger. A few moments later, he was already quietly suggesting that Celeste look back, because he wanted the girl to see the faces of the crowd of aristocrats. These were the same people who had once spread gossip about her. Now they hid their surprise behind fans or looked away. The usually silent emperor had already noted that many had hoped to use the ball to express their displeasure with him. But the girl had ruined their plans, and Celeste was already wondering if all this anger was really caused only by her appearance. Having invited the princess to dance, Mr. Batiso reminded her that it was too early to relax. After all, a gift was waiting for her. However, first she had to dance, and the beauty, realizing that she was a little shy, already felt her heart beat faster, and a blush appeared on her face. The crowd parted, and the emperor confidently led Celeste to the center of the hall. This evening she was bound to be the center of attention, the emperor thought. The gentle lilt of the music softly spread throughout the hall, and in the very center of it, a beautiful couple was already slowly circling to the beat of the music. And now the man asked the blonde how long she had been learning to dance, but the girl only quietly answered that it had not been long. Mr. Batiso praised the princess, as well as Turkan, who taught her to move like that. Looking at her future husband, Celeste thought that it was not in vain that she had rehearsed until exhaustion. And now the girl's heart was filled with pride. Now moving the beauty away, now bringing her closer during the dance, he understood that a lot had really changed during this time, and the princess had become much more self-confident. As they continued to dance, he said that he didn't know how small her hand was, and whether it was easy for her to hold a pencil, but the music was captivating them more and more. However, Celeste was surprised by such a question. After all, the man saw how confidently she held the cutlery. In a casual conversation, they continued to spin to the rhythm of the dance, and even smiled at each other. However, they were already being watched. Princess Elodia clearly did not like their mood, because she had other plans for the emperor. The aristocrats, having calmed down and gotten used to the fact that their princess was beautiful, gradually relaxed and began to enjoy the ball. As the emperor offered Celeste a seat, he could already hear the girl asking about the gift he had promised. The man was surprised at how impatient the girl was. However, turning to him, the princess carefully asked whether Mr. Batiso could not give her something else instead of a gift. Pouring wine into a glass, he asked the beauty what they were talking about. However, Celeste said that she would tell him about it after the ball. However, the request interested the emperor so much that it seemed he could not wait. And smiling, he asked to tell about it immediately. And from the outside, it seemed like they were a very happy couple. And of course, Elodia, who continued to watch them, couldn't help but notice it. And she, no longer able to stand still, was already moving towards the table where Celeste and the emperor were sitting. A black shadow approaching Celeste's face was already trying to close the dance floor. The beauty sighed, because she understood that she would once again have to fight with an aggressive contender for the emperor's heart. However, Elodia, with her eyes closed, was already greeting the greatest leader of Kalinef, Lord Batiso. The girl introduced herself and thanked him for the invitation to the ball. But the emperor's indifferent face showed absolutely no emotion. Moreover, he unexpectedly said that he doubted the guest's sincerity, and she, slightly worried, repeated again that she was truly very grateful for such a wonderful ball. In that case, Mr. Batiso continued, he asked him not to send him any more letters with strange proposals, but Celeste had already tried to stop him. However, the next moment, the emperor extended his hand towards the girl, which was completely unexpected for her. Holding the frightened blonde tightly to himself, The gentleman reminded the annoying guest that he had Princess Celeste, and the blushing blonde had already heard how the girl in the red dress, barely hiding her irritation, loudly declared that this place was occupied unfairly. But the emperor reminded his guest that he did not want to throw her letters in the wastepaper basket again, and at that moment, tears began to flow down Elodie's cheeks, which she tried to hold back. After all, the man had a habit of throwing out everything unnecessary, not only from drawers, but also from his head. And now he reminded the princess of this, who was in a hurry to leave the hall. And the curious public, once again joining the discussion, already drew attention to the fact that the princess from Kronak received a refusal from the emperor himself. But Celeste thought that the emperor had acted thoughtlessly. After all, he should have spoken to the princess alone. However, after a few hours, the palace was empty. Only the light in the windows tried to remind us that the building continued to live its nightlife after the holiday. The princess, having barely reached her room, collapsed tiredly onto her bed. Her body ached from endless dancing, and her shoes had long since become a torment. The princess felt as if she had not slept for several days. And now every thought was difficult. The image of Tarkan, thanks to whom the ball went smoothly, popped up in her head. And now the girl even thought about a gift for him. The princess closed her eyes and smiled. Despite the heaviness of the day, a feeling of inner joy filled her chest. However, Terega was already in a hurry to destroy her idol. The maid's gaze was worried, and her facial expression betrayed concern. After all, she was entrusted with conveying the order from the emperor, on the basis of which Celeste was invited to the reception room. As it turned out, the emperor wanted to see the princess immediately. Celeste was surprised, because she did not expect that after the ball, Mr. Batiso would again demand to see her. And Terega was already in a hurry to offer the princess a shawl to cover her shoulders. The aroma of tea, mixed with the subtle scent of dessert, filled the room. Everything looked calm and quite cozy. Sitting by the window, Mr. Batiso tried to justify his late conversation. However, he himself admitted that he could not fall asleep because of the girl, because his thoughts kept returning to her. And Celeste, sitting down opposite, did not expect at all that the emperor would be so impatient, because before everything looked different. Before voicing her request, she decided to find out if he was pleased with the princess's behavior at the ball. The man seemed to be expecting another question, but he answered this one with a yes. But the princess was afraid to get to the main point. Fingering the hem of her dress, she wondered whether it was worth saying this at all, and whether her request would seem impudent. Finally, overcoming her doubts, she said that she wanted their engagement to be officially announced. These words sounded unexpected even to herself. The emperor did not expect such a request. His face reflected obvious surprise. It was as if he did not immediately understand what he had heard. However, after a short time, the tension gave way to laughter. His voice echoed through the room, filled with genuine amusement and slight relief. Then he still wanted to know the reason for such a request. Celeste hurried to explain. After all, the girl was afraid of a long wait, and the wedding was still too far away. A smile flashed in his gaze, combining tenderness and understanding. But couldn't she just trust him? He asked. Celeste admitted that she trusted the emperor completely, but she didn't need words. She needed confirmation, something to cling to in her precarious situation. And the emperor, propping his cheek with his hand, looked thoughtfully at the girl. After all, he never expected that Celeste would decide on such a proposal. When he suddenly, confidently declared that he agreed to fulfill her request, Celeste was so surprised that she could not take her eyes off him. He also wanted to note her appearance during the ball and admitted that she looked impeccable. And the princess was grateful to him with all her heart and did not hide her gratitude. The beauty smiled, looking down. Not expecting the man to agree so easily, she internally praised herself for deciding on such an adventure. Without delaying the discussion, the emperor already asked the future bride in what format she would like to conduct the engagement. However, the girl did not want pretentiousness, and she said that she would prefer to be alone with him on the day she chooses. The emperor did not object. He only said that he would consult with his manager, who would handle all organizational issues. His gaze lingered on the red ruby ring he had given her earlier, the piece shimmering in the candlelight, reminding him of the importance and depth of their conversation. And now he asked how much the princess liked the gift. And Celeste, feeling a wave of happiness, admitted that she had never worn anything more beautiful. An expression of quiet and deep happiness appeared on the emperor's face, something he had not even thought about. Getting up from the sofa, the man was about to leave, realizing that all the issues had been resolved. And Celeste wanted to see the emperor off, but the man stopped her with a gesture. And respectfully bowing her head, she wished him good night. But she already noted to herself that today he was especially friendly. As Celeste watched the man go, she realized that she didn't know the emperor at all. But that evening, she had at least seen a little of what he might be like. Moving along the corridor, the emperor could not understand what was happening to him. After all, he did not even understand why he so quickly agreed to her request and met with her at all. Passing by the window, he felt a calmness to which he was not at all accustomed. This feeling was rare, almost unfamiliar, but surprisingly pleasant. Looking at his reflection in the glass, the emperor thought, after all, he could not understand why he came to the reception room that night. Celeste, remaining in the room, felt genuine joy that she had not spoiled the man's mood, despite her persistence. And Mr. Batiso, remembering the ball, was already looking at his hand, as if he still felt the touch of the princess. After all, he could not forget her voice and smell, which he liked so much. Gradually coming to the thought that he had never seen a more beautiful woman in his life, his mood rose, and she could have become his wife. Clenching his fist, he understood that something was changing inside him, and it was Celeste who was the cause of this internal transformation. Continuing to look at his reflection in the mirror, he had difficulty remembering at what moment it began and why the man had not noticed it before. That evening, the emperor did not want to waste time. He hurried to call Turkhan to discuss the future engagement, and soon Mr. Batiso was already explaining to the secretary that the princess had refused a lavish ceremony and asked to prepare something modest and without unnecessary luxury. Turkhan reminded that it was time for the emperor to rest and was already offering a cup of tea, which he had prudently prepared in advance. But Mr. Batiza, in high spirits, noted that he would do without tea today. After all, the rare feeling of peace allowed him to fall asleep anyway. The wizard was genuinely surprised. He hadn't seen his master so cheerful for a long time, and this didn't escape his attentive gaze. And already at breakfast, the emperor asked to give the princess a blue box. Inside it lay a ring with an amethyst as elegant as the princess. Having received the gift, Celeste was confused. After all, she had not expected a new gift, being content with a ring with a ruby. Such a generous repetition had already embarrassed the beauty, and she spoke about it. Meanwhile, Batiza, calmly continuing his breakfast and stabbing meat with a fork, was already asking whether the princess had suddenly stopped liking the rings. Changing her tone, she felt that there might be a negative reaction. Smiling, the princess noted that she had nothing against it at all. Looking into the eyes of the emperor, she noted with a slight smile that he was too generous to her. And with such frequency of gifts, she could inadvertently ruin Mr. Batizo. In response to her words, the man abruptly slammed his fork on the table, making it clear that his finances were quite sufficient to keep him from going broke. However, this was not what the princess had in mind. She sincerely believed that she did not need more than she already had. Reaching out for a bottle of red wine and looking somewhere past, the emperor was already saying that he had not bought the ring for the princess at all. The girl did not immediately understand what he meant. However, the next moment, changing his version, the blonde was already talking about finding the jewelry, which greatly surprised Celeste. But she, looking with surprise at the neatly packaged ring, assumed that the gift had a previous owner, who was now upset by its loss. The emperor's mood changed, and without hiding his irritation, he already stated that there was no reason to be upset because of his master, and he suggested that the princess simply wear it. Celeste thanked the emperor, and even tried to say that she appreciated the gift, despite the fact that the girl wanted to be reserved. However, despite her tone, the emperor flared up. The man's fists clenched, and his eyebrows drew together. He was clearly irritated, declaring that he was tired of talking. The princess turned pale. She did not understand what could have caused such an outburst of anger. Her confusion was replaced by anxiety and despair. Without holding back his emotions, the emperor was already calling his servant and demanding that he throw away the ring immediately. And he, without even having time to comprehend what he had heard, was rushing to fulfill the order. However, not believing her ears, Celeste was already asking why they were throwing away such an expensive and beautiful thing. But Mr. Batiso, continuing to drink wine, answered sullenly that this would be the most correct decision for the ring that no longer had an owner. Without taking her eyes off the emperor, who was emptying glass after glass, she asked in a trembling voice to take it for herself if the owner was not found. And he did not mind. Celeste exhaled. But her thoughts were already carrying her to the cozy salon where the girl had seen similar decorations. And now the idea of finding the real owner of the ring seemed more and more logical. While cutting the steak, she didn't even notice how quickly she used the knife and fork. However, the conversation no longer flowed, as if an invisible curtain had come between them. But nevertheless, they continued to engage in superficial conversation. As she lifted her fork to her mouth, Celeste noted with sadness that Mr. Batiso hardly touched his food. His plate remained untouched, and the emperor's attention was focused solely on the wine, and it seemed as if he had sat down at the table only to get drunk. She looked down and clenched her fists in excitement, quietly saying that the man had been eating poorly lately. The emperor knew about this, but indifferently replied that he simply had no appetite. However, Celeste did not give in and gently asked him to eat at least a little. The man pulled away, making it clear that he didn't want her to participate. Tarquin's persistence was enough for him, and now he didn't want anyone else telling him how to live. And Celeste had already promised not to give advice. And now she was only asking for forgiveness for invading his personal space. But the emperor, clutching the glass, only looked at her menacingly, and the next moment asked the beauty to shut up. The princess shuddered and lowered her eyes. She no longer knew how to behave, and was afraid that she was about to burst into tears right at the table. But suddenly, taking hold of the knife, he already changed the tone of the conversation. Now the emperor declared that in principle he did not object to her words and was again ready to listen to the girl. And she continued to look at the man in confusion, not understanding what was happening. She was amazed by the speed with which the blonde's mood changed. He asked not to be instructed any further, and his voice was firm, not allowing for any objections. At that moment, Celeste already understood that it was not about her at all. It was something personal that went deep into the past. In a sharp tone, he simply shouted that he could not stand lectures. But then, as if nothing had happened, he picked up the cutlery and finally returned to eating. And now he asked the girl to tell him something interesting, but the princess did not understand what she could tell the man who frightened her so much. However, having pulled herself together, Celeste was already talking about her studies, and also about how she enthusiastically studies the history of the state and the people it rules. The blonde understood that their relationship was still as cold as ice, but she noticed that with each meeting a drop of warmth appeared in them, and when Turkin brought tea again in the evening, the emperor looked into the cup for a long time, as if trying to discern in it the answers to his questions. His gaze was distant, his movements were slow, and the man did not quite understand what was happening to him and why he had become so strange recently. And the secretary, noticing the changes, was already waiting for explanations with restraint. The wizard could not see what the emperor was thinking about, but he felt that he was clearly in the grip of an internal struggle. However, he was already analyzing the events that had happened at breakfast with his arms folded. But he couldn't explain why he had lied to Celeste and why he had yelled at her. Realizing that the whole quarrel had started with an innocuous gift, Turkan cautiously inquired why the emperor continued to present the princess with jewelry. And Mr. Batizo, lost in thought, did not immediately find an answer. But soon he was already talking about the fact that women loved such decorations, and he saw how the jewelry emphasized the beauty of the princess, and how, thanks to them, the blonde blossomed like a flower under the rays of the sun. Blushing, he reluctantly admitted that he enjoyed giving her all this luxury. Even without touching his tea, he thought about Celeste again. After all, when she smiled, he clearly felt better, and the wizard, watching him, was already carefully pushing the Emperor to the conclusion that he had developed feelings for the girl, and the Emperor didn't object. And now he remembered how, passing by the windows through which he saw Celeste, he involuntarily turned his head to linger his gaze on her silhouette. He didn't understand what attracted him to the girl. Perhaps it was the fact that she grew up in the same environment as he did. But unlike Mr. Batiso, the princess was almost always in a good mood, while he, on the contrary, lived in an endless series of gloomy days and silence. He thought of Celeste's smile and felt a feeling growing inside him that he had never known before. Raising his head and folding his hands, the Emperor tried to explain what was happening, but he already believed that the reason was that he had not had a woman with him for too long. Leaning back on the sofa, the man noted that this was most likely the case. After all, he was tired of the loneliness that filled his nights, and the blonde's next desires came as a surprise even to him. After all, they turned his usual thoughts upside down and frightened him with their frankness. When Turkin ordered that he begin training the princess in the art of love, the man was determined. The wizard turned pale, completely unable to understand how to cope with such a task, and most importantly, with his feelings. His hands were shaking, but he nodded silently in agreement, still in confusion and inner tension. And yet, unsuspecting Celeste, continuing to study science diligently, was already feeling terribly tired. Looking at the stack of books, she realized that there was still a lot of work to do. But closing the book with a red cover, the princess realized with relief that her studies were over for today. The blonde felt her body go numb after several hours of motionless reading, and her eyes could barely make out the letters. The thought of going outside and breathing in the cool evening air was already taking hold of her with unexpected force. Having quickly thrown on a stole, the princess hurried to leave the office, trying to get to fresh air as quickly as possible and shake off the lethargy and drowsiness. But the girl was no longer worried that despite the confirmed engagement, she needed to look dignified and not be inferior to Elodie. She realized that to do this, she would have to study even harder and improve her manners, because her future role and status in this empire was at stake. But suddenly, her attention was drawn to a muffled voice, which seemed to whisper somewhere in the silence, breaking the stillness of the evening. Looking at the stairs, she realized that there was someone up there, and curiosity was already winning over reason. The princess understood that she had to check everything herself, and slowly, step by step, she climbed up, listening to every sound. Having reached the roof, Celeste exhaled from relief and fatigue. But what was her surprise when the blonde saw someone she did not expect to find in this place? Turkin stood before her, but his expression reflected only the young man's inner confusion. He was clearly not himself. Looking tensely at the girl, he was clearly thinking about how to present everything, and Celeste had already said that she had gone out into the air and heard a quiet voice. But the wizard claimed that he was the only one in that place. The princess opened her ears and continued to listen, but only the wind whispered to her about what was walking on the roof, and the young man, trying to pull himself together, was already evening out his breathing. His gaze slid over the princess's hand, where the ring was adorned. The question about the gift was important to him, because he wanted to hear something more. Celeste responded with pleasure that she liked the emperor's gifts. However, the wizard wanted to understand whether she appreciated the one who gave them. And soon, he was already talking about the fact that feelings for Celeste were growing in Mr. Batiso's heart. But the girl was quick to remind him that marriage is much worse when there is nothing between the spouses, and the awakening feeling made her happy. However, Turkan, clenching his fists, was already asking whether the princess would be able to reciprocate these feelings. But the princess never thought about this, as well as about unrequited love for the emperor. With his head down and his expression changing, the wizard was already saying that Mr. Batiso would never live up to her expectations. And so he advised her not to delude herself with illusions. Sadness was reflected in the girl's eyes. After all, she had long felt that she had been deceiving herself. She tried to convince herself that things had changed. She wanted to believe that their relationship had really changed for the better. But a light wind, running over Celeste's shoulders, already made her shudder from the coolness. And Turkin, without saying a word, was already throwing his cloak over her fragile shoulders. In a fit of inner turmoil, the secretary stretched out his arms to her, wanting to embrace her. However, he stopped, realizing that he had no right to do so. Bending down, he asked the girl to give up unnecessary hopes and dreams, which would only lead the blonde to pain and disappointment. And he was already saying something that horrified Celeste. After all, Emperor Kalanifa wanted the manager to teach the princess the mystery of the first wedding night.